It's 1965, and the Walt Disney Company is dominating American culture. Over the past 15 years, movies like Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, 101 Dalmatians, and most recently Mary Poppins have taken the box office by storm. Meanwhile, the introduction of Disneyland has revolutionized the amusement park industry, becoming the new gold standard of themed entertainment. But the limited space in Anaheim, as well as the lack of control on the region surrounding the park, prompted Walt Disney to dream bigger. Walt began the search for a new region to start fresh with the Disneyland concept, landing on a large patch of land in Central Florida. Walt began work on his new Disney World. But at age 64, Walt had begun to reflect on the impact he'd made on American culture. He was known as a showman, America's greatest entertainer, but Walt felt this was too small a legacy. He had bigger aspirations, grander ideas for a beautiful tomorrow, which led to his work on Epcot, a full-scale city meant to revolutionize the concept of the modern community. This city of tomorrow was meant to be Walt's shining achievement and place him among the ranks of the great American pioneers. There was only one problem: Walt's brother, Roy Disney. While Walt was the creative visionary, pushing animation and themed entertainment forward, Roy was the one who focused on finances and logistics. And the logistics of building a city of tomorrow were not all coming together. There were questions regarding human rights and governance, questions that Walt had little interest in finding answers for. This wasn't the first time Roy had voiced concerns about one of Walt's dreams. When Walt went to work making the first animated feature film, Roy didn't think it would make its money back. When Walt wanted to build Disneyland, Roy didn't think it would work. And Roy had pressing logistical concerns about Epcot, which led to tensions between the two brothers. Throughout the years, executives in the company had begun to take sides in the ongoing feud between the two, becoming known as Walt Men or Roy Men. The divisions between the two had started as small cracks when developing Snow White, but those cracks had grown, slowly forming into a chasm dividing each side of the Disney family. As Epcot continued development, it seemed tensions may finally snap soon enough. But unfortunately, the issues between Walt and Roy were never addressed. On December 15, 1966, Walt Disney tragically passed away. Walt had been dealing with lung cancer for some time, a fact that many in the company were unaware of. Although Walt never got to create his city of tomorrow, he still left a legacy that would be enviable to most. He'd raised the bar for practically every form of entertainment he ever worked in, being remembered as a visionary pioneer. And although he'd never built his city, Walt had left behind an empire, the Walt Disney Company, a living legacy of his own. Once, Walt had been asked if he'd consider running for mayor of Los Angeles. Walt responded, quote, "Why would I run for mayor when I'm already king?" In a way, he was right. Walt and Roy had built a massive organization from the ground up, and had become twin kings of their own sort of kingdom. But with the creativity of Walt suddenly gone, there was a void that needed to be filled if the company was to survive. For a time, Roy filled that void himself. Roy had planned to retire soon, being 78 years old, but he put off those plans to finish building Walt Disney World and make some of his brother's vision come to reality. And only 3 months after the park opened, Roy himself would sadly pass away. The question remained: who would take the reins in the absence of the Disney brothers? Who was capable of ascending to the throne? This is the story of those who attempted, failed, and succeeded. These are the kings of the Magic Kingdom. Above all, there was one man most concerned with protecting the legacy of Walt Disney. His name was Roy Disney Jr. Roy Jr. was the son of Roy Disney Sr. and nephew to Walt Disney. Growing up, Roy Jr. had been very close with his uncle Walt, with the two sharing an interest in creative storytelling. As a child, Roy Jr. enjoyed when Walt would read him storybooks, acting out each scene in dramatic fashion. Roy cherished these moments long into his adulthood, and once said that he was disappointed by the Disney release film Pinocchio, since it never lived up to Walt's own telling of the story. In his teen years, Roy Jr. found a new shared interest with his uncle Walt: trains. Walt had developed a bit of an obsession for locomotives, building a 1:8 scale train with tracks cutting through his entire yard, much to the disdain of Walt's wife Lillian, who was planning to build a garden. Walt and Roy Sr. had been neighbors for years, and their children spent a lot of time together. But even when they moved to different neighborhoods, Roy Jr. still made time to visit his uncle and ride the train together. In his adulthood, Roy Jr. had gone to work at the company, pursuing his interest in storytelling. He began working as a director on a number of nature films, stylized similarly to the work of Walt and the rest in the company. Due to his love for the company and his respect for Walt and his work, it may be fair to assume that Roy Jr. was next in line to take over leading Walt Disney Productions. But in reality, not so much. Although Roy Jr. did his best to keep a close relationship with his uncle Walt, as stated, the relationship between Walt and Roy Sr. was not doing well as the years had gone by. Issues over Roy Sr.'s apprehension in making Snow White, Disneyland, and Epcot were just the beginning of the problems. In fact, while the uncle and nephew bonded over their love for locomotives, trains were a bit of a sore subject between Roy Sr. and Walt. Although Disneyland was owned by the company, Walt himself had managed to retain personal ownership of the Disney Railroad and the planned monorail, forcing Walt Disney Productions to pay royalties to Walt. And that wasn't all. Walt's personal companies had managed to copyright the name of the man himself, meaning Walt Disney Productions had to pay royalties for the use of Walt Disney's name. Roy Sr. found this especially frustrating, since the original name of the company was the Disney Brothers Studio. Although they had changed it, since Walt was the creative face of the company, it was still supposed to be their company, not just Walt's. Eventually, Walt Disney Productions bought back Walt's personal companies and the rights to use of the names and assets, and Walt gave Roy Sr. a wooden peace pipe as a symbol of their reconciliation. But their relationship was never truly the same, and Roy Sr. worried his son would not be treated well within the company. And unfortunately, he wasn't entirely wrong. Roy Jr. was a shy and reserved man. He had ambitions as a storyteller of his own, but his goals were sometimes outshined by his quiet personality, and Walt seemed to perceive this as a lack of drive and strength of character. When Roy Jr. married Patty Daly in 1955, Walt said, quote, "Great news, my nephew's marrying a girl with some spunk." Walt confided to E. Carden Walker, the manager of ads and public relations, about his lack of faith in Roy Jr., saying that Roy would, quote, "never amount to anything." This led Card Walker to dub Roy the Idiot Nephew, a moniker that would float around the company for years to come. Instead of setting up Roy Jr. as his successor, Walt had his eye on his son-in-law, Ron Miller. Ron, a football player for the LA Rams, had married Walt's daughter, Diane Disney, in 1954. Ron was also a little shy and not too well-spoken, but rather than seeing this as a weakness, Walt saw Ron as somebody with promise, and someone who could be molded into a worthy successor. Diane once said of Ron, quote, "I think Dad was thrilled with the way Ron came along and grasped the business. And actually, Ron had no training for anything else. He was like a blank notebook. Dad could take him and mold him in his pattern. I think the nicest thing I ever did for Dad was that through some quirk of fate, I was able to marry a man who fit into Dad's dream." Walt brought Ron into the company in various roles throughout the years, helping him quickly rise in the ranks. After the death of Roy Sr., Don Tatum took the reins for 5 years, moving forward on many plans in animation and the theme parks that were in place prior to his arrival. Then, in 1976, Card Walker took over as CEO, and later as chairman in 1980, with Ron Miller serving as his president. At one point, Roy Sr. had unsuccessfully attempted to fire Ron Miller, which created further animosity between the Walt and Roy sides of the family. Because of these tensions and the negative perception of Roy Jr. from within the company, Ron and Card never seemed to really respect Walt's nephew. Although Roy Jr. was the largest individual shareholder in the company, holding 3%, the Walt side of the family owned a collective 11%, empowering Card and Ron to shoot down any creative suggestions that Roy made. Conversely, Roy was very popular with Disney fans, and played well at park and company events whenever he made appearances. After all, he had the Disney name, and happened to look a little bit like Walt Disney himself. But despite being a board member and holding a substantial stake in the company, he retained very little decision-making power. It was for these reasons that, at the suggestion of his lawyer and business partner Stanley Gold, Roy left behind his creative ambitions within the company to become an independent producer. The two founded Shamrock Holdings to manage Roy's assets, and Roy distanced himself from the company he had dedicated his life to. He cited his belief in the lack of creative vision in current leadership as the reason for his departure, and he wasn't the only one who felt this way. During this period, Disney Animation released Robin Hood, The Rescuers, and Pete's Dragon, while Disney's live-action releases were Freaky Friday, a couple of Herbie sequels, and The Black Hole. Some of these were successful, while others, particularly Pete's Dragon and The Black Hole, were considered failures. But despite a few successes, many animators felt that the company was becoming creatively bankrupt, with 15% of the animation department resigning in 1977, following famed animator Don Bluth to a new production company he had founded. Cardwalker operated under the philosophy of "what would Walt do?", an ideology that was restraining the company from reaching new heights. One of the main issues was that in recent years, Disney had gained a reputation for making kids' movies, making them uncool in the eyes of teens. So even if certain animated movies did well, the demographic that they were appealing to was beginning to shrink. In 1983, Ron Miller became the CEO of the company, with Card remaining on the board of directors. Ron made some strides to fix Disney's reputation with teens and young adults, founding Touchstone Pictures, a new branch of the company that could make adult-targeted films without releasing under the umbrella of the Disney brand. He also established the Disney Channel to expand the company's reach further into television. As well as that, the company made big moves in the theme park business during this period, opening Tokyo Disneyland and a new version of Epcot that was reminiscent of a World's Fair. However, despite Ron's efforts, it was clear that management was allowing the company to stagnate in the absence of Walt, and those outside of the company were beginning to take notice. Because of Disney's low stock price, low amount of debt, and high value, it had become a prime target for corporate takeover. In 1984, Saul Steinberg attempted to raise his holdings in the company from 6% to 25%, putting the company in play and forcing Disney to pay him green mail to prevent his takeover. They did this by using part of a $1.3 billion bank loan, giving the company more than $800 million in debt. They had staved off Steinberg, but there were more sharks in the water, and it seemed only a matter of time before Disney would be bought and scrapped for parts. And it was during this time that, out of those trying to take over Disney, a familiar face re-emerged: Roy Jr. Roy raised his stake to over 5%, forcing Card and Ron to admit that they had underestimated the, quote, idiot nephew. Roy was allowed to rejoin Disney as vice chairman of the board. Along with him, Roy brought Stanley Gold and his brother-in-law Peter Daly onto the board. They also planned to find a position for Gold's best friend, Frank Wells. As the sharks continued to circle around the company, Gold argued for a management review that would allow new faces in leadership positions and pull Disney from the depths it had found itself in. Miller agreed, seemingly unaware that he was the problem that they were all referring to. Miller had lost the favor of the Walt side of the family after he separated from Diane over an affair with another woman, and although they reconciled later, the period of separation was the perfect moment to unite the Disney family in pushing Ron out of the company. It would be fair to assume Roy might seek to take control for himself and lead the company to financial stability and a creative renaissance. However, Roy's ambition was not to lead the company, but rather to protect the legacy of his uncle Walt. Instead, he had someone else in mind. He picked up the phone and dialed a successful Paramount executive, a man named Michael Eisner. There were a couple reasons why Michael Eisner was an unconventional choice to lead the company. Walt Disney had grown up in Marceline, Missouri, the son of a farmer. Walt's adolescence in the small town was a time he cherished, and as he reminisced on those days in Marceline, he would learn the power of nostalgia. This would influence his work in both animation and in the design of Disneyland, particularly Main Street USA, which was patterned after Marceline. Walt and his brother Roy had worked tirelessly on their father's paper route growing up, as the Disney family was not wealthy, and everybody had to pitch in to make ends meet. Michael Eisner, on the other hand, had a very different upbringing. Eisner grew up in an apartment on Park Avenue, Manhattan, as part of a wealthy and affluent family. Eisner wore formal attire to his private school, and was expected to wear his uniform every night at the family's candlelight dinners. His father was not especially close with his children, having them refer to him by his first name, Lester. This prompted other schoolchildren to tease Michael, believing that Lester couldn't be his real father, because why wouldn't a son refer to his father as dad? Eisner was also a surprising choice because of his extensive background in Hollywood, as at the time, the Walt Disney Company and those within saw themselves as separate from the rest of the entertainment industry. Eisner had found success at NBC, CBS, ABC, and finally as the president and COO of Paramount Pictures, gaining him the attention of Ron Miller. Miller had actually considered recruiting Eisner to run production, and later considered him for Disney's COO, but Card Walker seemingly blocked this both times, objecting to bringing an outsider to the company. Despite the rejection, it was hard to scoff at Eisner's track record. Eisner had long operated under the philosophy of making high-concept, low-budget films, meaning films with concepts that were engaging and easy to summarize, but relatively low in cost to make. He believed that rather than banking on a home run with one film, it was smarter to go for singles and doubles. However, if the concept was strong enough to demand a higher budget, Eisner was occasionally willing to deviate from this philosophy. Under his leadership, Paramount released a number of films considered classics to this very day, including Saturday Night Fever, Grease, the Star Trek film series, Footloose, and Raiders of the Lost Ark, as well as classic television series like Laverne and Shirley, Cheers, and Happy Days. So it made sense when Frank Wells suggested to Gold and Roy that they reach out to Eisner. Roy already knew Eisner well enough, as they were both on the board at the California Institute of the Arts. Wells had also briefly gotten to know Eisner when they ran into each other at a ski resort. Wells was an ambitious and adventurous man himself, known for scaling mountains in his free time. There were talks of Wells taking the CEO role, with Eisner being his number 2. But Wells repeatedly pushed for Eisner to be number 1, being content to take the second place himself. Eisner was grateful to Wells for conceding the CEO position and supporting him for the role, but it was clear that Wells preferred it this way for his own reasons. Wells had previously been pushed into a creative position during his time at Warner Brothers, and never felt comfortable making such decisions. He was better suited to handling the business and logistics side of things, and knew Disney would be better suited for a creative leader. The terms of Eisner's arrival to Disney seemed set in stone, and were coming at the perfect time. Eisner's success had been so noteworthy at Paramount that he had earned the ire of Martin Davis. Davis was the chairman of Paramount's parent company, Gulf and Western, and resented the massive amount of media acclaim Eisner had received, for some reason feeling that he deserved the attention himself. When Davis called Eisner to a meeting, Eisner could see the writing on the wall, and knew his time at the company was almost over. The meeting was supposedly to hammer out Eisner's new contract, but Davis was reducing Eisner's pay dramatically in an effort to push him out. But during the meeting, Eisner couldn't help but blurt out, quote, "I think I'm about to be offered the CEO position at Disney." Davis, surprised, responded, quote, "I won't stand in your way." Soon, the day came for Eisner to receive the offer for the CEO position at Disney. He waited, and waited. Morning turned to afternoon, which turned to evening, when he finally received a call from Wells. "How do you feel?" Wells asked. Eisner was caught off guard. "How should I feel?" he asked. "Hasn't anyone told you?" Wells realized he was breaking the bad news to Eisner himself. Miller had been fired, but the board decided to conduct an outside search for a successor. Eisner wasn't out of the running, but if he wanted the position, he was going to have to fight for it. And fight he would, because unfortunately, he had already burned his bridge at Paramount. Although the writing had been on the wall ever since Roy returned to Disney, Ron was blindsided by the realization that he was being dethroned. He had been recruited by Walt Disney himself, and dedicated his short stint as CEO to helping Disney break new ground in the entertainment industry, but ultimately, it was not enough. When he found out he was being pushed out, he burst into tears, feeling betrayed. But prior to the vote to remove him, he composed himself and appeared before the board to make one final speech. "I'm very disappointed in this. I've given my life to this company. I've never worked anywhere else. I've made progress with this company. I think I've taken great strides in leading it as far as it has come. I feel like this is a betrayal," he said, staring straight at Roy. He turned to Gold. "Don't you have anything to say, Stanley? You talk so much all the time. You're really the ringleader of this." Another jab at Roy. To Ron, it seemed impossible that the idiot nephew could really be the one leading the charge on such a coup. The board sat silently as Ron walked out for the last time. Then, they held a vote and formally removed him as CEO. Over at Paramount, Davis pulled Eisner into another meeting and handed him the press release announcing his resignation. It was the end of the road. Eisner, fearful that Paramount would cheat him out of the remaining money he was owed on his contract, demanded a check for the full amount immediately. When he got it, he walked out of the meeting, to the confusion of everybody in the room, and went straight to his bank, demanding they deposit the funds into his account immediately before Davis could force the check to bounce. It was the last paycheck Eisner would be guaranteed for a while, and he knew it. But Wells, Gold, and Roy were not finished making their case for Eisner to join Disney, and they had just the idea for how to get him the job. They would go to every board member they could get a hold of, pitching Eisner as the ideal choice. But more importantly, Eisner would reach out to the largest individual shareholders, the Bass family. The family, led by Sid Bass, held a 5.5% stake in the company, and therefore had a good amount of influence on Disney's decision-making. Eisner got on the phone with Sid Bass and made the case for himself. Companies like Disney are always founded by creative executives, but eventually the founder dies or gets pushed out or moves on to something else. Inevitably, the business people take over, the managers, and they focus on preserving the vision that made the company great in the first place. They don't have any creative ideas themselves, and they end up surrounding themselves instead with analysts and accountants to try to control the creative people and cut costs. In the process, they discourage change and new initiatives and reinvention. In time, the company begins to ossify and atrophy and die. It's important to have financial parameters and never to bet the house, which is how we always protected Paramount. But in a creative business, you also have to be willing to take chances and even to fail sometimes, because otherwise nothing innovative is ever going to happen. If you're only comfortable running a business by the numbers, I can understand that. But then you shouldn't get involved with a creatively driven company like Disney. Eisner waited eagerly for a response. Sid thought for a moment. Then he simply said, quote, "You're right. We're with you." Soon after Eisner gave his speech, the Bass family raised their stake from 5.5% to 8.8%, further showcasing their faith in Eisner as a leader. Eisner also met with Ron Miller and Diane Disney, since the Walt side of the family held a considerable stake in the company as well. Miller asked how much Eisner would be asking for in stocks. 500,000 shares. Miller was shocked. That was an enormous amount, far more than the 25,000 he had been awarded during his time at the company. "Michael, they'll never give it to you." But Eisner shrugged. "Well, you've got to start somewhere. So," he continued, "do I have your support?" Miller was impressed by Eisner's boldness, and even more so, knew he was an excellent replacement. "You know what, Michael? You don't need it." And Miller was right. With the support of the Basses alone, Roy and Gold could threaten a proxy fight to replace any board members that refused to back Eisner's appointment. But quickly, it became apparent that this would not be necessary. Everybody on the board could already see where this was going. Even Card Walker, who had once refused to bring in Eisner, could see he had been wrong. Walker's wife spoke to Roy's wife, Patty, about Eisner, saying, quote, "I guess we bet on the wrong horse." Walker offered to make Eisner's nominating speech to the board when the time came, showing his clear endorsement. With the changes finalized, Eisner had ascended to the throne, leading the Walt Disney Company as its new CEO. Frank Wells would serve as the COO and president, reporting directly to the board. They had triumphed over uncertainty and won the trust of the board. Roy was the happiest of all, confident in his choice to place his family's company in Eisner's hands. Eisner said to Roy, quote, "You got me this job. I'll never forget it. If I ever lose your confidence, let me know and I'll resign." Roy doubted that day would ever come. But their work was just beginning. The sharks were still circling the company, and time was running short to protect Disney. Eisner and Wells had been crowned the twin kings of the Magic Kingdom, one leading creative and the other business, the same as Walt and Roy before them. Now, it was time to save the kingdom before it was too late. with many of the animators having left the company during the reign of the previous management team, and many of the films released during that period not meeting the level of quality expected of Disney productions. Eisner and Wells were tasked with returning the company to the stature it had fallen away from. There was only one roadblock. Eisner barely knew anything about Disney. Eisner's family didn't grow up watching Disney movies. Instead, his family spent their time watching either Broadway musicals or TV. He only saw his first Disney movie when he took his infant son, Breck, to see Pinocchio at a drive-in theater. He had never seen any of the other classic animated films and knew very little about the history of the company or the legacy of Walt Disney. Eisner himself admitted as much. Quote, "To be honest, I knew little about Disney. If Disney had not been under siege and under real risk of being acquired and sold off in pieces, I would not have passed the interview process." Once at Disney, Eisner had to do a crash course on the history of the company's founder. He quickly saw the differences in their upbringings, but at further examination, saw a similarity. Both men prided themselves in their creativity. While Eisner was certainly not the creative genius that Walt was, he had always had an interest in literature, playwriting, and scripting. Eisner often read and evaluated scripts in the departments below him, attempting to refine them. He gained a respect for Walt and his work, saying, quote, "I was awed, at a professional level, by Walt's immense creativity and originality, both as an artist and businessman stretching over a remarkable 40-year period." Despite proclaiming such respect and admiration for Walt and his work, Eisner and Wells seemingly didn't see much value in the animation division at Disney. In fact, they had quietly been planning to shut it down, until Roy asked to run the division himself. They conceded, since after all Roy was the reason both had come to Disney, but they clearly still intended to shut down animation in the future and took steps to do so. Animation, which had historically always taken place on the Burbank lot, was moved to a windowless warehouse in Glendale. When famed animator Stan Kinsey pitched a new form of technology, the Computer Animated Production System, or CAPS, as a means of elevating the possibilities of animation and streamlining the process, Wells cut him off, saying, quote, "We're gonna shut down animation. It's not making any money." It was true that animation was a mess, and losing the company money. But while Eisner and Wells saw animation as a dying branch that needed to be cut off, there was one executive that learned to value its potential: Jeffrey Katzenberg. Katzenberg had originally been the assistant to Barry Diller at Paramount, who found Katzenberg to be relentless and impossible to work with. But Eisner had taken notice of the young executive, noting his ambition and incredible work ethic. Despite Diller's warnings, Eisner took on Katzenberg as his own assistant, and while they didn't always get along, their combined work ethic yielded incredible results. Eisner had such respect for Katzenberg's abilities that he planned to immediately bring him along when he moved to Disney, and appointed him as the chairman of Walt Disney Studios, overseeing live action and animation. The first production that Katzenberg directed his attention to was The Black Cauldron, which had been in production for 10 years. The animation department was at the time divided by two generations. The second generation, who were trained by those who worked with Walt himself and worked to carry on their legacies, as well as the third generation, new animators that fought to break the mold and try something new. Many of these young animators went on to become big names in the industry, including John Lasseter and Tim Burton. But The Black Cauldron was a project heralded by the older generation and generally disliked by the younger. Oddly, despite being pushed by the older generation, who was known for trying to maintain the classic feel from old Disney movies, The Black Cauldron was actually quite a departure from the traditional Disney story, mainly due to certain scenes that were graphic, violent, and bloody. Katzenberg requested a preview of the film and exploded upon seeing the graphic content. He demanded that it be edited dramatically, as it was far too dark for Disney to release. When the animators tried to explain that you can't edit an animated film in the same way you could a live-action film, Katzenberg scoffed, storming off to edit it himself. But before he could do anything, Eisner called him. "What are you doing? Everybody's upset," he said. Right off the bat, Katzenberg had alienated everyone in the animation department, including Roy. Although Roy also took issue with the film, having already removed some of the most graphic scenes, he didn't appreciate the manner in which Katzenberg treated his team of animators. Katzenberg, as the head of production, technically ranked above Roy, who was the head of animation. But since Roy was a massive shareholder and a board member, not to mention a Disney family member, getting on his bad side was not a smart move. While Katzenberg was busy pissing off the animators, Wells was hard at work making big changes on the executive side. Unfortunately, it is somewhat typical for a new management team to start mass firing subordinates, trading old faces for new personnel. When Eisner and Wells arrived, there was a lot of anxiety from executives that many were going to be on the chopping block. Luckily, Eisner and Wells assured everybody that their intention was not to clean out the house. Unluckily, they immediately set off to do just that. Wells began sending 2 people to do one task, judging who did it better, then firing who did it worse. He continued doing this until more than 1,000 people were fired, some of whom were replaced with Paramount executives Eisner was more familiar with. Roy was also instructed to make a list of those in the animation department that he felt should be saved from a mass layoff. Things were clearly changing, but in the meantime, Eisner became focused on an element of the company that had long been missing. From his time studying Walt, Eisner had noticed a component which had been missing from the company for quite some time: a spokesperson. Through his appearances on the Disney anthology series, later known as The Wonderful World of Disney, Walt Disney had become a figurehead in American culture. This eventually led to Walt becoming a character of his own, Uncle Walt, a calming and well-spoken persona who worked well as a spokesperson for both Walt's ideals, as well as somebody who could excite the American public for whatever project Disney was working on next. Since Walt's death, there had been nobody suited from within the company to replace America's Uncle Walt. Eisner saw this and knew that this had to change. The company sought potential candidates, people like Tom Hanks or Dick Van Dyke, but everybody was either an ill-suited fit, unavailable, or not interested. So Eisner got another idea. What if he filled the role himself? This was unpopular with his fellow executives. Eisner hardly had the charm or acting abilities of any of the previous contenders, but he was determined to make it work. Eisner lost weight, tanned, and began practicing his vocal abilities with a coach on staff. He filmed his first test screening, and he was bad at it. Some in the company sugarcoated their notes on his performance, but Katzenberg honestly told him this isn't going to work at all. Still, despite their objections, Eisner kept at it and appeared in hundreds of episodes. He never reached the levels of charisma and warmth that Walt had communicated, but over time, Eisner was able to place himself in the public's view as the leader and spokesperson of Disney. Upon the arrival of Eisner and Wells, practically every department at Disney was losing money. But there was one exception: the theme parks. Tourists and local visitors frequented the parks consistently, and yet there was more money to be made. While in power, Cardwalker had been hesitant to raise the ticket prices for the theme parks, since he believed Walt wouldn't have wanted that to change, even as inflation had changed the value of the dollar over the years. Eisner finally allowed the parks to raise their prices, and immediately, the company earned hundreds of millions of dollars in additional income. They found that the number of visitors did not decrease as the price increased. With so much money suddenly on the table, Eisner and Wells looked to create another theme park, and began surveying Europe for potential locations. With a new level of success and revenue being generated from one department of the company, Eisner and the team were on the lookout for any new business ideas that the company could use to grow further. During this time, 3 ideas stood out. First, Steve Burke introduced the concept of the Disney Store, which allowed the company new outlets to merchandise their films and were very successful right out of the gate. The second idea pitched around this time was from Bill Mechanic, who pushed for Disney to release their films on VHS. Many were unsure of such an idea, as Disney had been re-releasing their films in theaters every 7 years, only to lock them back in the Disney vault. By only making their films available for a limited time on a 7-year schedule, it manufactured a sense of urgency for people to see their films again, before it was too late. As a compromise, they adopted a similar system with VHS releases, allowing customers to buy copies of the films for a limited time. This generated hundreds of millions in additional income, and any anxiety from making the films more available to the public quickly dissipated. The third idea came from Katzenberg himself. While Touchstone Pictures was the label Disney was using for adult-targeted films, multiplex theaters were beginning to pop up around the country, providing a bigger demand for new films. Katzenberg convinced Eisner to open a second adult-targeted studio called Hollywood Pictures to try to fill that gap, although Wells strongly objected to the proposal. It seemed to be a good idea though, After all, 27 of the first 33 films released under Eisner's leadership team had made a profit, so it seemed reasonable to expand production. And speaking of production, back in the live-action department, there was a new kind of film that the team had been toying around with. Who Censored Roger Rabbit was a novel set in a world where animated characters lived in real life alongside human beings. The book was risque and contained adult content, but Disney purchased the rights to adaptation anyway. There had been attempts to blend live-action and animation in the past, but the results had never been seamless. Combining the mediums perfectly in a feature film would be revolutionary, and Disney was seeking to do just that. However, the project had been through a few iterations and was stuck in limbo. Katzenberg helped bring Steven Spielberg on to produce a new iteration of the film, and hired Robert Zemeckis to direct. But in giving Spielberg and Zemeckis creative control on the film, Katzenberg found it difficult to stop them from dramatically raising the cost of production. Zemeckis also insisted on hiring Richard Williams to do the animation, who refused to move to Los Angeles, forcing production to move to London. Williams mainly hired his own animators for the project, disappointing most of the Disney animators who weren't allowed to work on it. Worse, it seemed that with every day of production, they would end up being another day behind schedule, mostly due to Williams' perfectionism. When Katzenberg finally told Eisner that the budget had inflated to almost $40 million, Eisner exploded, blaming Katzenberg for not telling him sooner and ordering him to get more involved and rein in the problems. Katzenberg reduced Williams' role as manager and tried his best to prevent the press from finding out about the film's issues. Eisner also focused closer on production, bombarding Zemeckis with notes, then complaining to Katzenberg when his notes were ignored. After enough micromanagement, Katzenberg finally snapped at Eisner, saying, quote, "I'm doing the best I can. If that's not satisfactory to you, then I'm not the person to do the job." Eisner stopped speaking to Katzenberg for a period of time, the first time they'd had a true rift grow between them. But the trouble paid off in the end. Who Framed Roger Rabbit made over $350 million at the box office, and even better, helped make animation cool to teenagers once again. By 1988, Disney had become the #1 studio. This seemed unfathomable, to go from a smaller company at risk of being scrapped for parts to a massive studio that beat out the competition. Operating income had risen from $300 million to $800 million. Despite the odds, Eisner and Wells had managed to not only save the company from takeover, but lead it to massive success. And their success was only just beginning. Those Disney animators who had been left out of Roger Rabbit's production were instead put on another project, The Little Mermaid, which would be followed by a number of wildly successful animations, and kick off a period in the company's history known as the Disney Renaissance. But despite the company's unprecedented success, Katzenberg felt a sense of uneasiness. Disney was riding higher than ever before, and he felt that this momentum was impossible to maintain forever. In a New York Times interview, he voiced his concerns for the future. Quote, "We are going to run into a bad streak. We are going to fail big. Just so the scales get properly balanced, we are going to have one of the all-time big flops." Perhaps Katzenberg was right. Maybe the good times could not last forever. Perhaps trouble was on the horizon, and perhaps trouble was brewing not just for Disney, but for Katzenberg himself. Tensions were growing further and further between him and the people he worked with. The animators disliked him, Roy had little respect for him, and now Eisner was beginning to turn on Katzenberg as well. These problems would need to be addressed, but nobody could have predicted how big the problems would become. With 1988 being a massive year for Disney financially, Eisner had suddenly become the highest paid executive in America. He was entitled to 2% of profits over $100 million, which totaled to a bonus of $6.8 million. He then proceeded to exercise some of his stock options, bringing his total income that year to $40 million. Katzenberg had negotiated a similar deal with Disney. Wells had agreed to a clause in Katzenberg's contract that guaranteed him 2% of the net profit from any project he worked on in the form of an annual bonus. Given that he'd helped lead Disney's film departments to massive success, he was excited to receive what he expected to be a massive bonus, similar to Eisner. but he was shocked to find that the amount he received was nothing. It turned out that because of the cost of distribution and marketing, the film departments were still running at a deficit. This is a somewhat common practice of studios, where, intentionally or otherwise, they will do their best to reduce the amount of profit on paper in order to prevent having to pay royalties to those who are contractually obligated. Katzenberg, of course, was furious at this. In his view, he'd led the film department from the brink of failure to unprecedented success and deserved a cut of the reward. He sent a memo to Welles indicating his frustration and received a diplomatic response. Welles said that Katzenberg's expectations were perfectly reasonable and indicated that in the future, perhaps the company wouldn't run at a deficit, and Katzenberg could earn that bonus he was expecting. This didn't change how Katzenberg felt. After all, Eisner had received a massive payout for his contributions. As his loyal subordinate, who played such a key role in the overall success of Disney, he clearly deserved compensation as well. Although Welles's response was calm and calculated, he wasn't entirely disingenuous. When Welles had initially promised Katzenberg 2% net profit, he confided to Eisner that Katzenberg would probably never make any money off the clause. But as Disney was beginning to rake in more money than ever before, it would be increasingly hard to run at a deficit. Welles began to think that perhaps he made a mistake in allowing Katzenberg his 2% deal and sought to renegotiate. Welles and Katzenberg went back and forth, trying to find new terms that they could agree on. Welles wanted the 2% deal to be made invalid if Katzenberg left the company. Katzenberg, in return, wanted a guarantee on 75% of whatever Eisner made, which Welles balked at. They went back and forth, but never got rid of the 2% deal. Katzenberg also wanted assurance that if Welles left, he was entitled to the position of president. Welles verbally agreed, but this was never put into writing. So Katzenberg instead earned a clause that allowed him to leave 2 years before his contract expired, in case he was not given Welles's job. Despite this, Katzenberg was seemingly more dedicated to the company than ever before. After negotiations concluded, he wrote to Eisner saying, "The last few months were very difficult for all of us, but they are behind us, and I just want you to know that I feel great about where we ended up. More importantly to me, way beyond the dollars and cents of it all, is the fact that in the end you came through and delivered for me. We've been together a very long time. In fact, in terms of Hollywood timekeeping, about 3 lifetimes so far. I not only hope, but I'm counting on us staying together forever. You've been great. You've handled my crap with extraordinary patience and care and understanding. I'm deeply appreciative and do love you for it, Jeffrey." After the success of Oliver and Company, there was an interest in making the next Disney animation into a Broadway-style musical as well. Howard Ashman was approached to work on the next Disney project, The Little Mermaid. Ashman had gained notoriety recently as the artistic director behind the Broadway adaptation of Little Shop of Horrors. However, Ashman was hesitant for one particular reason. He was gay. And Disney, a company which prided itself on traditional family values, was not without its controversies regarding homosexual discrimination. There had previously been an instance where Disney refused to allow homosexual couples to dance in their nightclub at Downtown Disney, prompting a highly publicized lawsuit. But Ashman was assured that he would be judged solely on the merits of his work. And with his extensive knowledge of the Disney mythology, he was the perfect choice to help compose the memorable soundtrack that helped define The Little Mermaid. Katzenberg was highly impressed with Ashman's creative abilities and was enthusiastic about the film, along with the rest of the executive team. With the production of The Little Mermaid, the animation team finally implemented CAPS, the computer system that helped expand the limitations of the animation, as well as streamline the process. Because of the inflated budget, the system was not pushed to its highest capabilities, but it was a step forward for the medium nonetheless. The film, upon release, was a massive success, grossing $222 million worldwide and kicking off the Disney Renaissance. Animation, despite still being stuck in Glendale, was no longer at risk of being shut down. It was quickly being recognized as the backbone of the company, and the executive team refocused their attention on the department. They wanted more, and they wanted it as fast as possible. Katzenberg was the most relentless in his pressure on the animators, making his new mantra, bigger, better, faster, cheaper. Demands were stacking tall, the hours were running long. and resentment was growing further towards the executives. The animators came up with the nicknames for each main player on the executive team. Eisner was sarcastically known as Dad, and Katzenberg Mom. Whenever the two started arguing, animators would joke that Mom and Dad were fighting. Meanwhile, they indicated respect for Roy by calling him the Shepherd, as well as the Godfather. And the Godfather was worried that Katzenberg's pressure to make films big, fast, and cheap would just end up making them worse. Eisner was also growing frustrated with Katzenberg, finding that he was always running a mile a minute and was sometimes hard to track down. Eisner complained to one of his lawyers, quote, "If Jeffrey was on his way to Washington, I wouldn't even know. I would say to my secretary, I need to talk to Jeff. She would find him on the plane. I would say, where are you? He would answer, on the plane. Oh, I would respond, where are you going? He would simply say, Washington. He would never give Frank or me any more information. We would have to dig and dig. We mostly gave up." Along with the lack of communication, trust was becoming an issue as well. Ever since Katzenberg exploded upon seeing the Black Cauldron, Eisner was slowly becoming more reluctant to trust Katzenberg to handle projects like that on his own, especially projects that Eisner cared about himself. On the other hand, Katzenberg eventually stopped inviting Eisner to screenings, which Eisner perceived as shutting him out of the production process. Katzenberg tended to take the reins, often by force, on any project he was assigned to. And since Eisner also kind of liked to do that, they were starting to have more friction. Meanwhile, the live-action team was hard at work on what was meant to be the next Disney blockbuster, Dick Tracy. Directed by and starring Warren Beatty, Dick Tracy was meant to be Disney's response to the 1989 release, Batman. But Beatty was a perfectionist, insisting on taking scenes over and over, running the budget up quickly. He was also causing drama by having an affair with his co-star Madonna, while unbeknownst to her, he was having other affairs with other women on set. Having dealt with soaring budgets and troubled production before on Roger Rabbit, Katzenberg quickly intervened, spending as much time as possible on set, stepping in when needed in order to keep the budget down. The final cost was $47 million, but in reality, it could have been much higher. Still, Disney believed in the movie and put another $54 million into marketing alone. But in the end, the film grossed $100 million, basically breaking even. What Disney had seen as their next tentpole ended up being quickly forgotten by the general public. Clearly, Eisner and the team had strayed from their singles and doubles philosophy. Whereas before, Eisner had preached about avoiding big talent with high price tags and elaborate movies with expensive concepts, Disney's string of successes had lured them into a false sense of security. The board was beginning to worry that Eisner was straying too far from his original vision for the company. Eisner, for his part, wanted to go the way of the general public and have everybody forget about the big mistake that he greenlit. Except, Katzenberg didn't let him. Katzenberg sent out a 28-page memo to Eisner and the executive team. "As we begin the new year," it read, "I strongly believe we are entering a period of great danger and even greater uncertainty. Events are unfolding within and without the movie industry that are extremely threatening to our studio. Since 1984, we have slowly drifted away from our original vision of how to run a movie business. Once, we had a fairly strict and pretty successful philosophy, which we have referred to as our singles and doubles philosophy. At some point, we seem to have replaced it with a strategy that might best be called the yes but philosophy, as in, yes, he's expensive, but it's a great opportunity for us. Or, yes, that's a lot to spend on marketing, but we have too much at stake not to. Our initial success at Disney was based on the ability to tell good stories well. Big stars, special effects, and name directors were of little importance. Of course, we started this way out of necessity. We had small budgets and not much respect. So we substituted dollars with creativity and big stars with talent we believed in. Success ensued. With success came bigger budgets and bigger names. We found ourselves attracting the caliber of talent with which event movies could be made. And more, we began making them. The result? Costs have escalated. Profitability has slipped, and our level of risk has compounded. The time has come to get back to our roots." Katzenberg then turned to naming out specific failures that Disney had made along the way. Dick Tracy is a case in point as to how the box office mentality is affecting the movie-going experience. When Warren Beatty comes to us to pitch his next movie, a big period action film costing $40 million with huge talent participation, we must hear what they have to say, allow ourselves to get very excited over what will likely be a spectacular film event, then slap ourselves a few times, throw cold water on our faces, and soberly conclude that it's not a project we should choose to get involved in. Katzenberg stated that Dick Tracy was an example of Disney losing control of their destiny. He continued, naming off Steve Martin, Bill Murray, Dustin Hoffman, and Sylvester Stallone as expensive actors that Disney should have never negotiated with. Eisner had certain comments he could make here or there in response to Katzenberg. He felt a mix of agreement and resentment at such brazen criticism of his methods. But overall, his main concern was ensuring that the outside world would never gain access to this memo, as it would not only prove embarrassing for Disney to outright admit defeat with Dick Tracy, but would hurt the relationship between the company and all of the named actors. Worst of all, it would reflect poorly on Eisner himself and the leadership of Disney as a whole. On 2 separate occasions, he wrote back to Katzenberg to tell him not to let the memo get out. Later, they had dinner together. Eisner admitted to Katzenberg, quote, "Sometimes I get the feeling that I'm competing with you." Katzenberg, still feeling incredibly loyal to Eisner, was shocked. "How could you say that?" Eisner dropped it, and they continued eating. But soon, Eisner's fears were realized. Variety published the entire memo, having received it from an unnamed source. Eisner was furious, and of course, he wondered, could Katzenberg have intentionally betrayed him and released it himself? It was possible, however. Around 24 copies had been circulating around the office. It could have been anybody, but Eisner was convinced it was Katzenberg, and he wasn't the only one who took issue with the contents of the memo. Bill Murray criticized the company on Larry King's show, and Warren Beatty cut ties with Katzenberg, refusing to speak to him. Eisner clearly felt any sort of trust in Katzenberg was gone, and wanted to get rid of him. There was only one problem. Per his 2% deal, he may have been entitled to a massive payout if terminated. Eisner and Wells needed to know how much it would cost to get rid of Katzenberg. Wells went down to the accounting department and pulled an accountant into a private office. She was assigned to work on a top-secret project known as Operation Snowball, which had one task: figuring out how much money the company owed Katzenberg, or in other words, how much it would cost to get rid of him. While Eisner and Wells calculated how badly losing Katzenberg would hit the Disney wallet, Katzenberg was hard at work, oblivious to the growing animosity towards him. He quickly signed Ashman to 2 new projects in development, Aladdin and Beauty and the Beast. Ashman also recommended they bring on composer Alan Menken, who had written the lyrics for Little Shop of Horrors. Initially, Disney intended for Aladdin to be released first, with Ashman already having an outline of the script and several songs completed. However, Eisner didn't believe that a movie set in the Middle East had wide enough appeal, and directed the team to focus first on Beauty and the Beast. Beauty had been in production for a while, but Ashman scrapped everything and reworked the script into a musical format. Ashman had gained significant creative freedom after the success of The Little Mermaid, allowing him to insert a long opening number, Belle, introducing the titular character. He had helped catapult the animation department to widespread acclaim, and now their next film was poised to raise the bar even higher. But things seemed off with the artist. Unknown to Disney, Ashman was not well. He confided to his domestic partner, Bill Lausch, "I've got to tell them." And what he had to tell was not good. Ashman had contracted AIDS, and his health was declining significantly. He had resisted telling Disney, as the stigma towards the disease was high at the time, but now he felt he had little choice. Katzenberg's response was quick and decisive. He said, "Okay, what do you need? We'll do it." At a great expense to the company, the entire production was moved to a hotel in New York to be near Ashman. As the film was further refined, Ashman continued watching screenings, reviewing storyboards, and composing the music. His voice was degrading, and his eyesight was beginning to fade. But he pressed on, determined to realize his vision for the film. He made the point of view character the Beast, finding his turmoil of being beautiful on the inside and a monster on the outside to be extremely compelling. He designed Gaston to be the exact opposite, handsome superficially, but a repulsive and evil human being. He pitched the idea of the kitchen and dining objects coming to life as actual characters. And better yet, the cap system, which had been used minimally in The Little Mermaid, was utilized to its fullest potential, creating sweeping scenes on a grand scale unlike anything that preceded the film. And it was during this time when The Little Mermaid received 2 Academy Awards, one for the song Under the Sea. Menken accepted the award alongside Ashman, but afterwards, Ashman finally told Menken of his condition, shocking and upsetting him. An early screening of Beauty was shown to the press and critics to help place the film in contention for Oscar nomination, and yet Ashman was unable to attend. Katzenberg visited him in the hospital after the screening, alongside his business associate David Geffen and Peter Schneider, president of Feature Animation. Geffen took Ashman's hand, who was blind and unable to communicate. "You're going to recover," he said. "This is going to be cured. A miracle will happen. You have to believe, just as you have inspired so many people to believe in magical things. You must never give up, and I want you to know that you are surrounded by people who love you." They were unsure if Ashman could even understand them, until tears fell from his eyes. Geffen made bold and touching promises to Ashman, but the bitter truth was clear to everyone in the room. A week later, Ashman would pass away, never getting to see the completed film he had worked so hard on. The death of Howard Ashman had a profound effect on Katzenberg. Ashman's DNA was so immediately present in The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, and the soon-to-be-released Aladdin, which he had continued to work on before his death. Katzenberg said he felt guided by the spirit of Ashman, as well as Walt Disney, to help push the medium of animation forward. But more immediately, he wanted to help honor the work Ashman had done on Beauty and the Beast, as it prepared to debut soon. He helped orchestrate the auction of original artwork for the film, and had the proceeds donated to the Gay Men's Health Crisis in Ashman's honor. As everybody filled the El Capitan Theater, which Disney had recently restored, it was clear that Ashman was a missing presence felt by all, and Roy, along with the film's director, paid tribute to him before the film rolled. Eisner came up to the stage, seemingly to pay tribute to all the hard work of the team. Instead, he had an announcement. "I decided today to build a new animation studio on the lot." Triumphant cheers rang out from the crowd of animators. The worries of losing their jobs were gone, as they were freed from the Glendale warehouse, soon to triumphantly return to their rightful place on the Burbank lot. All were filled with glee, except for one man in the crowd, Katzenberg. Eisner had blindsided him with the news. Katzenberg and Peter Schneider were planning to move the group to a high-rise in Burbank, and Eisner knew about this, but intentionally did not tell Katzenberg of his plan to return animation to the lot. Silently, everybody could see from the anger on Katzenberg's face to the joy on Eisner's. This was a power move meant to humiliate Katzenberg. Eisner went to dinner with the Disney family that night and reportedly bragged about upstaging Katzenberg. Katzenberg began to fear that the dynamic between him and Eisner was irreparable, but there was still time to try to mend things with the other executives. He set out to win over Roy. While traveling with his deputy in animation, Thomas Schumacher, Katzenberg point-blank asked, "Why doesn't Roy like me?" Schumacher hesitated, but decided to be upfront. "You dominate, you showboat, you take all the credit." Katzenberg then instructed Schumacher to write a comprehensive list of the reasons Roy disliked him. The list included items such as rudeness, arrogance, ignoring the artist's concerns, dismissing Roy's input, and more. Katzenberg read all this and said, "I get that." As Katzenberg studied the list of grievances towards him, Eisner and Wells were beginning to have trouble in paradise themselves. Disney had continued development on their Europe park, landing in a location outside of Paris, France. Eisner had spent a short time in Paris in his young adulthood, wanting to be a playwright in the gorgeous city. This lasted about a week before he returned home, but his heart never truly left the city of romance. He yearned for a second chance to make a creative debut, and with Euro Disneyland, he finally saw his opportunity to lead the charge and expand his kingdom to the region. There was just one small issue. The French public was not interested. They saw Disney as a symbol of American excess, and although some gave the park a chance upon its opening, it did not reach the numbers it needed to make its massive budget back. This not only held back further development for Euro Disneyland and its planned second gate, but it held back development in the entire parks division. Disney Parks had once been the only department making the company money, but now it was being weighed down by one big mistake. A mistake that Eisner seemed to blame on Wells. At one point, Eisner called Gold and asked if he could fire Wells. "Are you out of your f***ing mind? You're a team. You both report to the board." Not only was firing Wells a terrible idea, but since Wells reported to the board directly, Eisner had no power to fire him, and Eisner's temper was beginning to weigh Wells down. Once, when Wells was exercising with Gold before going into work, Wells refused to leave. "I'm not going to work." Gold was surprised that his workaholic friend would even consider missing a day. "What's the matter?" "I hate it. I hate Michael Eisner. I can't go in there anymore and take the..." Wells stayed at Gold's house for the day, but Gold knew his commitment to the company and knew he'd be back the next day. While Wells had to deal with his share of grief, Eisner's temper was directed mainly at Katzenberg and had finally reached a boiling point. Eisner asked his longtime friend, Michael Ovitz, co-founder of CAA, to help him find a replacement for Katzenberg. To any outsider, this seemed absurd. Katzenberg was no doubt overbearing, rude, and difficult to work with, but the results of his work spoke for themselves. Ovitz assumed Eisner would change his mind, but after Eisner called Ovitz 7 days in a row with the same request, Ovitz finally gave him a candidate, Joe Roth. Roth had been the head of Fox, having recently left and started his own production company. Ovitz suggested bringing him in as an independent producer, and just keeping him on standby in case Katzenberg had to be replaced. So Eisner called Katzenberg and told him to make a deal with Roth's company. He also suggested that Roth could fill in for Katzenberg when he inevitably got to, quote, move up in the company. Nobody else in the company was fooled by this claim, and multiple people warned Katzenberg that Roth was meant to replace him. Roth himself even told Katzenberg, "I've got the feeling they want to park me at your place, and I'm not sure that's good for you." But Katzenberg scoffed, claiming it was his idea to hire Roth in the first place. David Geffen, business partner and personal friend to Katzenberg, warned him about Roth too, but clearly Katzenberg had taken what Eisner promised him at face value. Surely this was a sign that their relationship was on the mend, after the issue over the studio move. And to be fair, it seems that Eisner was oscillating back and forth between wanting to keep Katzenberg and wanting to toss him out the window. After bringing in Roth, Eisner told Katzenberg he expected Wells to stay a year or two more. "If that happens, I'd expect you to assume the number 2 job. In the meantime, I'm prepared to make clear that you are number 3. I'm prepared to make you vice chairman and put you on the board, if that's what you want." It wasn't. Katzenberg suggested making Wells the vice chairman and becoming president in his place. Eisner denied him this, and Katzenberg backed down, seeming to regret suggesting it. Katzenberg expressed that he needed new mountains to climb, and that he wanted more responsibilities. Eisner went to Wells and told him his version of events, pointing out that Katzenberg wanted to take his job and essentially have Wells demoted. "Jeffrey really said that? I'm just amazed by his chutzpah." While Eisner was supportive of Katzenberg to his face, behind his back, Katzenberg was gaining more enemies than he realized. Katzenberg, despite having faith restored in Eisner, could see that the company was dragging its feet on promoting him, and even on giving him more responsibilities. So in renegotiating his contract, Katzenberg pushed for the ability to leave the company within a given 30-day notice. Eisner liked this, because it also meant that he could fire Katzenberg on a 30-day notice, so he accepted. And with this, any perception of friendliness between the two disappeared. Katzenberg ordered his subordinates not to speak with Eisner, and if Eisner reached out to them, they had to report everything that happened during the conversation. He complained that Eisner was, quote, meddlesome and crazy to Peter Schneider, who had secretly been recruited by Eisner to spy on Katzenberg and report on his activities. Things were getting ridiculous, but outside of petty differences and escalating grudges, there were real concerns about some of Katzenberg's behavior. Katzenberg had been taking animation cells from classic Disney movies out of the company vault to keep in his own collection. When Schneider suggested that this was inappropriate, Katzenberg argued that Walt had done the same. "But you're not Walt," Schneider said. "I'm the Walt Disney of today," Katzenberg proclaimed. Once Roy heard what Katzenberg had said, his disdain for the executive was solidified. Katzenberg, despite his incredible work ethic and list of achievements, was becoming a major roadblock to communication between the executives. Outside of the company, things seemed to be going well, with releases like The Lion King and Toy Story reaching critical acclaim and commercial success. But behind the scenes, entire departments of the company were being cut off from one another over the fight between Eisner and Katzenberg. The only hope for reconciliation was Frank Wells. Wells had always served as an excellent partner to Eisner for one reason: his skills as a diplomat between executives. If someone had an issue with Eisner, they went to Wells, who sorted it out promptly. The damage caused by Katzenberg and Eisner was soon to be irreparable, but if anybody could fix it, Wells was the one for the job. Thankfully, the Easter weekend was approaching, as everybody clearly needed time off to decompress from the massive tensions within Disney. There were cracks forming in the foundation of the Magic Kingdom, and once the weekend ended, it seemed it would be up to Wells to fix them. It's Easter Sunday, and Michael Eisner is taking a much-needed break. Having recently joined the exclusive Bel Air Country Club, but never having the time to visit, Eisner took his wife and younger son, Anders, golfing with him. Eisner had plans to share an Easter dinner with his son, Breck, and Breck's wife, Georgia, but they were running late, putting dinner behind schedule. Although Breck was frustrated at his father's tardiness, he was happy to see the entire family sit down together for dinner. But right after they sat down, the phone rang. Breck got up and answered. It was Michael's secretary. Odd, since she would usually never interrupt a family dinner such as this. Michael picked up the phone. "Michael, Frank is dead." He was stunned, finally managing to ask, "What happened?"
It's a somber mood that hangs over the Walt Disney Studios in Burbank, California today as Hollywood says goodbye to Disney's late president, Frank Wells. Wells died when his helicopter crashed in mountainous northeast Nevada last week. He was 62. He was returning from a weekend ski trip. Many celebrities and executives are expected at today's memorial service. It will be broadcast by satellite to Disney's theme parks around the country.
On April 3rd, 1994, Frank Wells had been on a skiing trip in a remote region of the Nevada mountains, along with his son, his climbing partner Dick Bass, and actor Clint Eastwood. On the way back from the trip, Wells boarded a helicopter, with Bass, Eastwood, and Wells's son having left an hour prior. Due to poor weather, Wells's helicopter had to make an emergency landing, where snow fell into the engine. When they took off again, the engine failed, and the helicopter crashed, tragically killing 4 out of the 5 passengers, including Frank Wells. Soon the other executives learned of Wells's death. Roy had been driving with his wife Patty to visit their son for Easter dinner. Their car broke down and they had to be picked up by a truck, arriving late. Only then was Eisner's secretary able to reach him. Roy turned to his wife. "My God, Frank is dead." Stanley Gould's family had just finished dinner early and were on their way home. Suddenly, Gould's phone rang. It was his secretary. "Are you driving? Pull over." "What is it?" "I just heard from Lucille. Frank was killed in a ski accident." Gould's head dropped to the steering wheel. Wells was his best friend. In a company of clashing creatives and micromanaging executives, Frank Wells was a stabilizing force that helped guide everybody towards the path of success. He was an excellent mediator, seemingly eager to tackle any issues between executives and smooth over the differences between them. Everywhere Frank went, he carried a piece of paper in his wallet with the quote, "Humility is the essence of life." And Frank's level-headedness made him an incredible leader in a team of clashing personalities, able to solve interpersonal disputes of any kind. In a way, all roads led back to Frank Wells. The highway of communication flowed successfully in the company, often directly because of his involvement. And without him, that highway was in danger of crawling to a standstill. Eisner spent the day contacting everybody he could to tell them of Frank's passing. But it wasn't until the end of the day, around 9:30 p.m., that Eisner finally gave Katzenberg a call and told him. Eisner said that his family were going to meet and offer their condolences to Frank's wife, Luann. Katzenberg offered to join, but Eisner said that this would be inappropriate. Instead, Eisner instructed Katzenberg to inform his people of Frank's death, and said they could meet early the next morning to discuss the future of Disney. "We have to keep the ship on an even keel," he said. The next day, Katzenberg arrived to work at 6:30 a.m. He noticed Eisner was not in yet, so he told his secretary to clear his schedule, anticipating a meeting with Eisner soon. Katzenberg sat at his desk and waited. When the phone rang, he snapped up to answer, but always found somebody else on the other end of the line. Executives occasionally peeked into his office, fishing for any news about Katzenberg's future, but he had nothing to tell them. He phoned Eisner's office and reached Eisner's assistant, who said he was meeting with the board about the very issue Katzenberg was inquiring about, the succession of Frank Wells. Around noon, Katzenberg met with Eisner, and the two walked together to the weekly staff lunch meeting. As Katzenberg filed in with the rest of the executive team, Eisner's assistant began handing out the planned press release, announcing the company's next steps in Frank's unexpected absence. Finally, Katzenberg's expected ascension to the number 2 position would be announced. Except, the press release was announcing something else. Eisner himself would be replacing Frank Wells, taking the responsibilities of president and COO on top of his role as CEO and chairman of the board. Katzenberg was devastated. All he could bring himself to say in response, following the meeting, was, quote, "That's entirely appropriate." Eisner was relieved, taking this to mean that he had dodged a bullet. But to Katzenberg, this was the end of their 19-year-long relationship. In reality, this was a pragmatic move for Disney to make. For one, Eisner was someone that Wall Street would perceive as reliable to take on added responsibilities given his track record, and this meant the stock price would hopefully stay consistent. But the main reason Katzenberg was not promoted was that seemingly Eisner did not want him to be. And perhaps to prevent this, or perhaps just because he felt like it, Eisner had destroyed the board's opinion of Katzenberg after constantly complaining about him to anyone who would listen. It also didn't help that Roy did not like Katzenberg or trust him for Wells's position. Speaking to Eisner, Roy said of Wells, "He was unique. You can't clone him." But it was clear that he felt Katzenberg was the wrong choice, should the time come to appoint a new president. And clearly this was meant to be temporary. Eisner taking on the role of chairman, CEO, COO, and president was a massive consolidation of power, and far too many responsibilities for one person. Hypothetically, Katzenberg could still be a candidate in the future, as unlikely as that seemed, given Eisner's seeming hell-bent on sabotaging his chances. But either way, Katzenberg was done waiting. The next day, Katzenberg called Eisner to a meeting of his own, something he had never done before. They met for lunch privately. "What's going on?" Eisner asked. Katzenberg confronted Eisner about his promise to promote him to Wells's position. "I don't get it. Tell me that you meant it, or tell me that you've changed your mind. Just be honest." Eisner wasn't intimidated. "What's the alternative?" "If you can't tell me after 19 years, if you can't tell me, then you've told me everything I need to know about my future. I've hit the ceiling. I have to move on." Eisner became irate. "Are you putting a gun to my head?" "Just be honest with me," Katzenberg said. "After 19 years together, I've earned the right to be your partner." "I'd rather not discuss this now," Eisner deflected. "Let's concentrate on Frank." Katzenberg pleaded. "You can trust me to be as good as Frank." Eisner snapped. "I trust you, but not the way I trusted Frank. We've had terrible problems in this area of trust. I do not want to tiptoe around WDI the way I have to tiptoe around animation. I can't be shut out in the parks the way I'm shut out in live-action features." He paused to compose himself. "I might consider it down the road, if you earn it. Let's see how it goes." "I'm not going to audition for you," Katzenberg said. "Not after 19 years. You should know me by now." Eisner pivoted to Katzenberg's issues with other executives. "Why, for someone who wines and dines the press, the Spielbergs, the agents, can't you perform talent relations with Roy?" Katzenberg knew Eisner had a point. "Give me 60 to 90 days. It's done." "It will take years." Katzenberg pushed further. Give me the job of president for 2 years, and if it doesn't work out, fire me. No. Silence filled the room. Eisner finally spoke. Are you saying to me that if I do not commit to you now that within 60 to 90 days you will be the president of the Walt Disney Company, you will leave? Correct. And without another word, Eisner walked out of the room, followed by Katzenberg, leaving in opposite directions. A week later, almost 5,000 people gathered on the Disney lot for Frank Wells' memorial. The choir from the First African American Methodist Church sang hymns at the ceremony. Frank had worked with them in the past on Disney's behalf to organize aid for the less fortunate in South Central Los Angeles, and after hearing of Frank's passing, they offered their services for the memorial. Many volunteered to speak about their time knowing Wells, including the chairman of Warner Brothers, Bob Daly, as well as Robert Redford and Clint Eastwood. Then, Eisner approached the podium. It was rare for Eisner to get emotional, but he struggled at moments to get through his tribute. More than anyone I have ever met, Frank was willing to embrace the most creative and theatrical ideas. Sleep was Frank's enemy. Frank thought that it kept him from performing flat out 100% of the time. There was always one more meeting he wanted to have. Sleep, he thought, kept him from getting things done. He fought it constantly, but sleep, Frank's enemy, finally won. He continued to describe the great character of his former partner. He was a man unfettered by jealousy, competition, or personal ambition. His personal agenda was the company's agenda. Every minute of every business day, Frank was out for the interest of the Walt Disney Company. He was a man who held a moral compass that was always true. Intentionally or not, Eisner was describing both the attributes he respected in Frank and those he felt Katzenberg lacked. Katzenberg, in Eisner's view, was driven not by a strong moral compass or interest in the company, but by his own personal ambitions. With the memorial behind them, Eisner and his team refocused on the needs of the company. And to Eisner, it was time for the company to address, in his view, its most pressing need: getting rid of Jeffrey Katzenberg. First, Eisner began erasing Katzenberg's name from projects he was involved in. Katzenberg had recently helped lead the charge for Beauty and the Beast to debut as a Broadway play. Katzenberg saw it as a means of further celebrating the work of Howard Ashman. Katzenberg even put Human Again, an Ashman song that he had cut from the movie, back into the Broadway version, which pleased those who had been close to Ashman. The show did extremely well right out of the gate, selling out rapidly. But when the audience sat down, they might have noticed Katzenberg's name was missing from the credits. Katzenberg certainly noticed, but pretended not to care. He was more focused on trying to win favor with Roy, hoping that could save him. Unfortunately, it seemed it was too late. Roy's opinion of Katzenberg certainly wasn't helped when one reporter, after getting a behind-the-scenes look at production for The Lion King, called Katzenberg, quote, the reincarnation of Walt Disney. When the film opened to a massive commercial success, Katzenberg called Roy to congratulate him. Roy said, "Thank you." Then he hung up. The responsibilities of being both Disney's CEO and president were far too much for Eisner to handle alone, and the board, knowing this, began to push Eisner to pick a successor, in the event that something might happen to him. Gold suggested bringing Senator George Mitchell in. Mitchell had no creative or business experience, which some might have seen as a major issue, but Eisner liked the idea, since he'd never have to worry about Mitchell trying to compete with him creatively. Mitchell resisted, not wanting to leave his home on the East Coast, but promised to join the board once he left the Senate at a later date. Instead, Eisner began to consider his longtime best friend Michael Ovitz. Ovitz seemed like the perfect choice in many ways. He had co-founded the Creative Artists Agency, becoming a well-known figure in Hollywood who was held in high regard by the talent he had worked with. Eisner and Ovitz's families were also close, and vacationed together frequently. There had been talks here and there of Ovitz coming to Disney over the years, but knowing he needed to pick a president soon, Eisner began to more seriously consider his friend as a candidate. Eisner decided that Joe Roth, who he'd brought in as a potential replacement to Katzenberg, could run the movie studios, while he planned to assign Rich Frank as head of TV, home video, and the Disney Channel. With all the pieces coming together, it was nearly time for Eisner to make his move and push Katzenberg out of the company. Eisner met with Ovitz to discuss potentially bringing him into Disney. Ovitz was open and excited about the prospect. "I'm ready for a change. I think the idea of working together is great. We would make an unbeatable team." Despite both the men's optimism, for some reason, Eisner didn't make clear that he wanted Ovitz to be the president right away. He kept referring to Ovitz coming on as his partner. Ovitz questioned if this meant he would be co-chief executive alongside Eisner, and this caused Eisner to worry that being the president was too small a role for Ovitz to be content with. Eisner had liked that Wells had willingly allowed him to take the #1 position, but when he was threatening to fire Wells, he was frustrated to find that only the board had the power to fire him. If someone were to replace Wells, Eisner felt the hierarchy would have to fall below him to prevent anyone trying to compete with him. And despite there being no reason for Ovitz to know to do this, Eisner was expecting his friend to concede power to him exactly as Wells had, in order to ease his worries. It was becoming apparent that the paranoia and distrust caused by Katzenberg, the stress of dealing with Wells's death, and attempting to somehow replace him were beginning to weigh heavily on Eisner. When leaving the meeting with Ovitz, Eisner noticed a strange lingering pain in both of his arms. He assumed it was just a symptom of the stress he was under, and tried not to think about it. The next day, he attended a meeting with Tom Murphy, the chairman of Capital Cities ABC, a network Disney was considering buying. During the meeting, Eisner could feel his stress growing, and worried that his health was in jeopardy. He called to have his secretary schedule a stress test. The results of this test were not good. Eisner had a 95% blockage in a major artery, prompting an immediate quadruple bypass heart surgery. Ovitz and his wife were planning to fly out to celebrate their 25th wedding anniversary, but when they got the call from Jane, Eisner's wife, informing them of his surgery, Ovitz scrapped their plans and immediately flew to Los Angeles. When he arrived at the hospital, he saw that his friend looked terrible. Eisner was pale, motionless, and had a tube lodged in his throat. Ovitz took charge, sent Jane home for rest, and set up a security team to guard Eisner from the press or any unwanted visitors. He created a schedule so that Jane, himself, or one of Eisner's sons would be by his side at all times. When Eisner woke and had the tube taken out of his throat, he immediately wanted to know if anybody from the company had talked to the press about his condition, specifically Katzenberg. Luckily, Katzenberg had not said anything to anyone about it, because nobody had told him what had happened. It wasn't until Katzenberg called Eisner's home to report on box office numbers that Jane told him what happened. He was shocked, asking, "Who else knows?" She told him that the press had not gotten a statement yet, but Sid Bass, Michael Ovitz, Stanley Gold, Roy, Sandy Litvak, and a couple more had heard about it. He knew Jane would have only told the people that Eisner trusted, and this meant he was no longer one of them. Despite Ovitz's best attempts to shield Eisner from the stress of the outside world, he insisted on reading the papers. On July 20th, Eisner read the headline, quote, "Hollywood sees tension at Disney," in the New York Times. The article compared Eisner and Katzenberg and outlined the tensions between the two within the company. "Mr. Eisner is secretive and has few close friends. Mr. Katzenberg is vocal and has a range of acquaintances and relationships. He was somewhat disturbed to be treated as less a friend than an employee, even while Mr. Eisner was in the hospital recovering from heart surgery." The article also had an anonymous quote from one of Katzenberg's, quote, "closest friends," who was almost certainly David Geffen. The question is, does Michael want to share power with Jeffrey? If he doesn't, Jeffrey will leave the company by the end of the year. It was fairly obvious to Eisner that Katzenberg was behind this being published. After all, he had allowed his memo to be published all those years ago, had made press coverage of The Lion King about himself, and seemingly pulled strings in the media all along. It seemed unlikely that he had nothing to do with this article being published. The next month, once Eisner was recovered enough to be back home, he summoned Katzenberg to his house. Eisner complained to Katzenberg about the stress he had been caused by the press, and the veiled threats of Katzenberg quitting, but suddenly, Katzenberg interrupted. "I never told Frank Wells how much I liked working with him and how much I loved him." Eisner went silent. Katzenberg was never usually so emotional. "I realize I never told you how much you've meant to me. Now I guess it's time for me to move on." It seemed that the stars had aligned in Eisner's favor. Katzenberg was choosing to leave, freeing the company from the frustration of dealing with him. It was the easiest solution. which is why it's strange that Eisner pushed back. "Have you taken another job?" "No, not yet." "Is it something we can discuss?" Katzenberg admitted that he could not change the negative opinions Roy or Gold had of him. "I can fix it," Eisner insisted, offering to go to the board and champion Katzenberg himself. He asked Katzenberg to write up a memo describing his plan for a company restructure in the wake of Wells's death, a job that the president would usually do. Katzenberg decided to hold off leaving, although he was understandably confused. It seems inconceivable for Eisner to be offered exactly what he wanted and then resist it. There could be many reasons for why he did this. Maybe he did not feel the company was quite ready for the management change. Maybe he was still on the fence. Maybe Eisner, after being thanked for their time together, felt a renewed connection with his longtime collaborator. Or, alternatively, perhaps after laboring over his plans to get rid of his subordinate, Eisner felt he had been robbed of the satisfaction of firing Katzenberg himself. No matter the reason, it was only a couple of weeks before Eisner had made up his mind. When Katzenberg arrived to a meeting with Eisner, he expected to present his memo that would help restructure the company. Instead, Eisner handed him a different kind of notice, a press release announcing Katzenberg's resignation. "This is a day I've dreaded for a long time," Eisner said. "I wish it hadn't come to this and that we could have made it work. But I'm not going to be able to give you the job you want and you're not satisfied with the one you have." Katzenberg put the press release down. He was hardly surprised. "There are two kinds of divorces," Katzenberg said. "One in which you're best friends and the other in which you're enemies." Eisner responded that he would like to be friends. So Katzenberg only asked for a few things in his remaining time at Disney. He wanted to oversee the release of a couple of films he had been involved in, and also wanted to be there for the Lion King premiere, where Elton John was hosting a party in his honor. Most importantly, Katzenberg wanted assurance that he would get his bonus. Eisner seemed fine with all of these terms. So, finally, the ball was in motion for a much-needed change at Disney, and the two men felt the tension finally dissolve between them. Katzenberg had been told the press release would not go out until 2 p.m., but by the time he got back to his office, Disney had made their statement. Katzenberg did not have another job lined up or any real plans for a next step, until he got a call from Steven Spielberg, who was visiting Roger Rabbit director Robert Zemeckis. As Katzenberg and Spielberg discussed his leaving Disney, Zemeckis yelled from the background, "You guys should do something together." It wasn't a bad idea. Katzenberg hung up, then thought for a moment. He pulled a large folder labeled Michael out of his desk, and he slowly began going over each document, tearing the pages one by one and throwing them in the bin. Spielberg and Katzenberg, along with David Geffen, decided to start a company of their own, which would eventually become DreamWorks Animation, and Katzenberg's relations with Eisner were not helped by the rumblings of this new partnership. Spielberg was quoted in the press comparing Eisner to Machiavelli, enraging the Disney CEO. Then, Katzenberg's lawyer gave Disney a deadline of 2 weeks to pay his bonus. In response, Disney tried to force Katzenberg out of his office before his 30 remaining days at the company concluded, but he refused to leave. Things escalated when Eisner barred Katzenberg from attending the Lion King premiere, a project he had been a big part of. Katzenberg's final days at Disney came and went with little fanfare. He got 2 going-away parties, but they were thrown unofficially in California and Florida without the company's direct involvement. The 2-week deadline laid out by Katzenberg's lawyer passed without a response. Then, the next day, Eisner visited Katzenberg's house. Eisner accused Katzenberg of weaponizing the media to get his way. "You know how to stop it," Katzenberg said. "You have not fulfilled one single promise that you made me in terms of how you were going to deal with this. You've done an assassination job on me. I've yet to be paid a nickel. Deal honestly with me." But Eisner was not there to argue. He was there to deliver the final blow. Eisner claimed that there were ambiguities in Katzenberg's contract, and that the board would need to approve any sort of bonus payment. The board, which Eisner had seemingly turned against Katzenberg. "I can't go to the board right now," Eisner claimed. "They're too angry with you." Katzenberg was livid. No matter how upset the board may have been, he felt that they were still beholden to his contract. He he marched into Eisner's office the next day, slamming a memo written by Wells in 1988 on the desk, which outlined the terms of his deal. My 11-year-old would read this and understand what it means. Eisner was taken aback, and only managed to say that Sandy Litvak, the company's counsel, would have to determine that. But any hopes of working through this disagreement were dashed when Katzenberg's lawyer made a grave error. The New Yorker was writing an article about the ousting of Katzenberg, which he and Eisner were both aware of. Katzenberg's lawyer tried to fax a response from Katzenberg to the author of the article, which said, quote, "Thanks for all your help." But instead, he accidentally sent it to Eisner. It seemed it was another instance of Katzenberg weaponizing the media against him. Eisner spoke to Tony Schwartz, the author of his autobiography, about the incident. Quote, "So Jeffrey is caught in his tracks. I decided it is over forever. I don't care what he thinks. I'm not going to pay him any of the money." With the changes finalized, Eisner was now essentially the CEO, COO, president, and chairman of the board, the sole king of the Magic Kingdom. And without the frustrations of dealing with Katzenberg, Eisner was seeming to enjoy his new combination of powers. However, the board of directors felt differently. In a relatively short span of time, Wells had passed away, and Eisner had undergone a quadruple bypass heart surgery. If anything happened to Eisner, there was no real candidate in place to take over as the leader of the company. Things were changing rapidly at the top ranks of Disney, and there was a clear need for stability. But despite their concerns, the board was not privy to all of the changes taking place. They could see the changes in ranks, but what they failed to see was a changing Michael Eisner. It is common for those who undergo heart surgery to encounter feelings of depression, insomnia, and lack of focus. Larry McMurdy, writer of Terms of Endearment, which Eisner had adapted at Paramount, wrote a letter to Eisner describing his emotional journey after a heart surgery of his own. Eisner penned a response, and was candid about the differences he felt in himself. "Something has happened to me that is a big deal. I am no longer immortal. I am no longer even young. I still go to the office and still am basically the same person. But there is this giant hole which I guess is called middle age. I do not like what has happened, but I guess it's better than many I know. I don't have cancer or any other horrible illness that I know about, but I am different. My life has a finite sense to it, and there is certainly a hollowness that comes with such realizations. I try not to think about it, but I think about it all the time. I used to put up with betrayal as a reality in life, and now I won't let it in the door, even if there is a blockbuster motion picture associated with it." While the board was unaware of Eisner's looming feelings of mortality, they were more afraid than ever that something might happen to him. So, they began to pressure him to pick a successor. Eisner was resistant, seeing a successor as a competitor. But the doctors, along with his wife, were pushing for him to find ways to reduce stress in his life, and picking a reliable president who could take the weight off of his shoulders would certainly be a step in the right direction. There were multiple people hoping for the chance to take the position during this period. Sandy Litvak, Disney's legal counsel, had been waiting for his chance to become president for a while. Stephen Bolenbach, Disney's CFO, had been hired from Marriott years prior after Eisner promised to consider him as a replacement for Wells. Disney had also recently purchased ABC, and Eisner was quickly impressed by a young executive at the company, Bob Iger. But he hardly knew Iger and was not seriously considering him. In fact, despite getting the hopes up of a number of candidates, Eisner seemed to only be considering one person, Michael Ovitz. Eisner called Litvak to a meeting. Litvak hoped that this would be his chance to finally take his place as Disney's number 2 executive. Instead, Eisner took out a notepad and drew a line down the middle, writing pros and cons on each side. He asked Litvak to list the good and bad of hiring Ovitz as the president. Litvak was crushed, but played along. Eisner took the position of listing as many pros as he could, while Litvak gave some cons, without aiming them too directly at Ovitz. Eisner secretly worried that Ovitz would have trouble adjusting from an agency setting to a company like Disney, although he kept his worries to himself in front of Litvak. While listing the cons, one of Litvak's worries stood out among the rest. Quote, "If things go wrong, you not only lose a colleague, you lose a friend. It could be very messy." There was no clear consensus within the company on whether or not they should bring Ovitz in. Some felt it was a good choice, while others hesitated, but they were running out of time to decide. Ovitz had also considered going to Universal, feeling he would have more creative freedom at Disney's competitor. They were nearly ready to sign a contract, but at the last second, the heads of Universal pulled back on certain terms of the deal, forcing Ovitz to walk away. Unfortunately, the same day negotiations ceased, news headlines reported on the rumors that Ovitz might be going to Universal. This put a lot of pressure on Ovitz to find another job soon, as CAA was upset to find out he was planning to leave this way. He returned to negotiations with Eisner, and made it known that if he was coming to Disney, it needed to be sooner rather than later. With pressure mounting on both sides, Eisner offered Ovitz a handshake deal. He would not make him COO as Wells had been, but he would make him president, reporting to Eisner rather than to the board. Ovitz was agreeable, and the full contract was drafted up. The board did not get the chance to discuss their apprehensions over hiring Ovitz, as they did not get to see the agreement that weekend, even though they were supposed to approve it. Eisner finalized the deal, and called Ovitz to get confirmation that he was coming to Disney. Ovitz hesitated, asking for a few minutes to discuss it with his wife. Ovitz was worried primarily about one thing: his relationship with Eisner. After all, it was clear that Eisner, who had been close to Katzenberg for nearly 2 decades, had pushed him out, and from a certain perspective, betrayed him. Ovitz was Eisner's best friend, but he worried that Eisner might eventually turn on him as well. He talked with his wife for 10 minutes, and they decided that this was the right move. Surely Eisner would not treat Ovitz, his best friend, the way he had dealt with Katzenberg. So Ovitz called back and told Eisner he was in. Ovitz would be the new president of the Walt Disney Company. Eisner hung up. Then he called Tony Schwartz, the author of his autobiography, saying, quote, "I think I just made the biggest mistake of my career." Ovitz arrived at Eisner's house Sunday night to go over the press release announcing his hiring. He approached the dining room, where their families had shared many dinners together. But as he got closer, Ovitz overheard Eisner having a loud conversation with 2 people. Why were there other people here? They were just supposed to go over the press release. Ovitz walked in, and the conversation came to a screeching halt. Eisner was sitting at one side of the table. John Dreyer, head of PR, was standing to the side. And on the other side of the table, Ovitz found Sandy Litvak, lead counsel, and Stephen Bolenbach, CFO. Both who had been in line for the president position, and both who were snubbed in place of Ovitz. "Welcome to the company," said Bolenbach. "I just want you to know I'll never work for you." Litvak joined in. "Me too. I'm not going to report to you." Ovitz was shocked. He felt ambushed, and shot a look to Eisner as a signal for help. But Eisner said nothing. He wanted to see how Ovitz handled himself. Ovitz knew this was a major problem. Wells had overseen the legal and financial departments, and without having jurisdiction over them, he was left with much less to oversee than expected. He worried for the future of his position. In fact, Eisner had only told Bolenbach that he was hiring Ovitz that afternoon. Eisner promised him that Ovitz would not oversee finances, as Bolenbach's contract guaranteed him additional shares in the company if he ever reported to anyone other than Eisner. Eisner later stated that he was impressed by Bolenbach standing up to Ovitz like that. Ovitz tried to employ the friendly and outgoing persona he had used to successfully barter with top creatives and talent for years. He tried to reassure the two that they could trust him to oversee them, but Litvak and Bolenbach would not budge. Ovitz knew he needed Eisner to put his foot down, so he pulled him aside. "You did a really good job with that," Eisner said. Ovitz was bewildered. Was this some kind of test? He pleaded for help, but Eisner shut him down. "I can't do that. Look, that's the way it is. If you don't want to do the deal, just tell me so right now." Perhaps Eisner was trying to push Ovitz to back out of the deal, but both men knew that was not an option. Ovitz had already had one deal fail publicly, and he could not afford to lose another like that. Besides, Ovitz had already begun selling his interest in CAA. Ovitz later stated, "I had no choice. I could not walk away from the Walt Disney Company. I had given up my business. I had been put in a position that I had made a deal that I agreed to with Mr. Eisner. I shook his hand. I intended to keep my end of the bargain. I expected him to. I trusted him. I'm a team player. I wasn't going to let this guy down. I was incredibly disappointed. I didn't know what to do." The next day, Disney announced Michael Ovitz as the new president of the company. Although the media noted the odd lack of jurisdiction over legal and finance, Ovitz was hailed as the perfect choice to help lead the Magic Kingdom. But deep down, Ovitz knew the truth. He confided in his wife, quote, "I just made the biggest mistake of my career." Ovitz arrived at Disney after Labor Day, eager to turn the negative perception of him around by hitting the ground running. He took the elevator up to level 6 and walked to Wells's office, ready to move in. Only he was again surprised by Sandy Litvak, who had already taken residence there. Bolenbach had an office nearby as well. Even Joe Roth had a nice office on the executive level, but there was nowhere for Ovitz to move into. Eisner sent him back to the elevators down to level 5 with the department heads and lower-ranking executives. But Ovitz was determined not to lose momentum. He had been known as the guy who could close any deal in Hollywood, a personality that everyone gravitated towards. All he needed to do was turn the negative perception of him around, show them how hard-working he was, identify the problems they all had, and work to fix them. So Ovitz examined the pros and cons they had dealt with when Katzenberg was at the company. Pro: Katzenberg worked incredibly hard, doing 12-hour days regularly. Okay, then Ovitz is working 12-hour days as well. Con: Katzenberg was bad at communicating and would make decisions without consulting Eisner. Okay, then Ovitz would copy Eisner on every message and give him his schedule every day. But as Ovitz was planning ways to endear himself to his fellow executives, he received a memo from Roy stating that Peter Schneider, who was running animation, would report directly to himself and Eisner. Once again, Ovitz was being cut out of a department without even getting the chance to work with it. No matter, Ovitz was still determined to make it work. He set out to identify problems with the departments he was running and help solve them with the skills he brought to the table. One of the company's biggest problems was with their recent acquisition of the ABC network, which was struggling to establish a solid programming lineup. Ovitz called Brad Gray, a producer he was associated with, and began laying the groundwork for a deal to bring him into the network. The only problem was that he did this without consulting Joe Roth, Bob Iger, or anybody involved in ABC. Eisner shut this down fast, seeing this as confirmation that Ovitz was wrong for the job. And to be fair to everyone else, there were certain problems with how Ovitz conducted himself. Ovitz saw Eisner's lunch meetings as a waste of time, often coming late, leaving early, or being absent altogether. Ovitz was also a bit of a socialite, giving expensive gifts to talent and throwing lavish parties using the company's money, some of which reached price tags close to $100,000. In Ovitz's defense, however, after Katzenberg's infamous memo, Disney was not known as a very talent-friendly company. The company also tended to resist spending large amounts of money for talent that was in high demand, usually preferring to lowball them and hope they sign on anyway. This was the downside to Eisner's singles and doubles strategy, that the company, in trying to keep costs down, held their purse strings pretty tight when it came time to make a deal. Luckily, Ovitz was all about making deals, and he was all about getting in good with talent. Ovitz hired 5 different assistants, one whose job was to specifically coordinate gift giving. Ovitz's penchant for giving gifts to win people over was a pricey philosophy, but one that had paid dividends for him and CAA in the past. Regardless, Disney ran things quite differently, and Eisner saw this as a big problem. Ovitz decided to try again to fix ABC, this time with the involvement of the network's executives. He quickly identified one of the lowest performing divisions, the ABC newspaper group, and proposed selling it. The executives at ABC agreed, and later, they all met with Eisner to pitch the idea. Eisner shut the proposal down, going around the room to everyone involved in the project and asking for their opinion. One by one, each person said they thought selling any assets was a terrible idea. Ovitz was stunned. "Guys, we just spent 5 hours on the plane discussing this and agreeing on this." Nobody responded. They all just looked at Ovitz like he was crazy. Despite Eisner's objections to any proposed changes for ABC, he had his own set of frustrations with upper management at the network. As Eisner became more involved with programming, Bob Iger, president of the network, began to butt heads with the executive. Eisner would often reference his previous successes, such as greenlighting Happy Days and Laverne and Shirley. "It just doesn't work like that anymore," Iger would say. But Eisner was not deterred. He pushed Ovitz to find a replacement for Iger, but Ovitz knew that this was a bad idea. Iger, at the relatively young age of 44, had helped steer ABC to incredible success in the past. He was a hard worker, smart, and most importantly, provided a sense of continuity for the network after the Disney acquisition. Ovitz met with Iger and his fiancée, Willow Bay, for dinner, where they talked over the issues. "I can't take this," Iger reportedly said. "I'm supposed to run ABC, but I have no authority." Ovitz was brand new, and already feeling a similar way about Eisner's overbearing and micromanaging style of leadership. But he knew how important Iger was, even if Eisner thought otherwise. So he spent the next 3 hours talking about what a creative genius Eisner was, and explaining his intentions more clearly. He urged Iger to push on, and ensured that things would level out in time. Iger agreed to remain at the company, but he was still unsure. Ovitz only told Eisner that Iger was unhappy, careful not to betray Iger's confidence. He suggested getting him a gift to smooth things over and encourage goodwill. Eisner scoffed. "Why? He's got a contract. He's not going anywhere. Don't you want him to be comfortable, happy in his job?" Eisner thought about it for a moment. "Not really." But Ovitz pressed Eisner further, until he finally relented. Ovitz picked out a watch, a Breguet Era Naval, for $3,500. Later, at a retreat, he pulled Iger and Eisner aside, and presented the gift. "We'd like to give you a present for being such a great soldier in helping merge the two companies." Iger opened the box, and was stunned. He loved the watch, but he was a bit embarrassed to be awarded for just doing his job. Both him and Eisner looked uncomfortable, before Iger thanked them and quickly excused himself. Ovitz was feeling more than ever that, try as he might, he was failing to fit into the company culture. Something had to change. Nearly every time Ovitz saw a problem and tried to fix it, he was shut down by Eisner. He needed to find a way to turn things around. Luckily, there was still one problem that needed solving. The biggest problem of all, Jeffrey Katzenberg. Eisner had refused to pay out Katzenberg's bonus, knowing that he was contractually obligated to do so. David Geffen had previously offered Eisner a deal, saying, quote, "Jeffrey will take $60 million. Each of the DreamWorks partners were putting $33.3 million into the business at the start, and after tax, that deal would allow Katzenberg enough to put in his share. But Eisner refused. "He's not entitled to anything," Eisner said. "This is going to get settled," Geffen warned, "and it won't be for $60 million. Each time the price is going to go up." Later, Geffen unloaded on Eisner in the press, saying, quote, "Michael is a liar, and anyone who had dealt with him, genuinely dealt with him, knows he is a liar. Anybody who worked for me who contributed as much as Jeff Katzenberg, I'd call them chairman of the board. But Michael is a very, very ungenerous guy. He suffers when anyone else shares the credit." Eisner was holding a grudge, and at this point, he did not care about reputation or cost. And it turns out, DreamWorks was quickly costing Disney a lot of money. DreamWorks was poaching a number of Disney animators, signing them on to lucrative contract deals. Disney was then forced to raise the pay of their animators significantly in order to compete. But still, one by one, Disney was losing personnel. Eisner put Ovitz to work, assigning him to touch base with key animators and convince them to stay. Ovitz was successful, as every animator he was assigned to stayed with the company. But he could see that Eisner and Katzenberg's personal issues were affecting the business, and Eisner was avoiding confronting these issues at every turn, even skipping Bob Iger's wedding after learning Katzenberg would be there. Ovitz saw the problem and decided he would dedicate his time to working out a solution. He first approached Litvak, who despite hating Ovitz, agreed that they needed to work out a deal. Then, Ovitz placed a call to Katzenberg. "Jeff, I want to talk to you about trying to figure out how to stop all these atrocities that are going on." The two men agreed to meet and discuss a potential solution. When Ovitz arrived, Katzenberg calmly laid out the situation as he saw it. He just wanted the money that was owed to him, and although the ongoing success of the films he had been involved in made that dollar amount hard to determine, he did not care about the exact amount. He simply wanted Eisner to act in good faith and pay him at least some of what he was owed. Katzenberg asked Ovitz to negotiate with Geffen on a dollar amount, then arrange a meeting between him and Eisner. When Ovitz talked to Eisner and Litvak, they agreed that a settlement of $80 million would be acceptable. Ovitz went back to Geffen and was told that Katzenberg wanted $100 million. They agreed on $90 million. Finally, a deal had been reached. Except, not so fast. Because when Ovitz presented this deal to Eisner, he and Litvak exchanged a look, before turning and informing Ovitz that they were not going to settle. Ovitz could not believe it. "You're going to run up $20 million in legal fees. You could be on the hook for $200 million. But Litvak chimed in. "Katzenberg is misreading the contract. He's not entitled to anything." Once again, Ovitz had been betrayed, and had failed to close a deal. And worse, it was beginning to seriously affect his reputation. Geffen said as much when he talked again with Ovitz. "This isn't the old you. You could close anything. You could get it done. Now you have no credibility." Ovitz was devastated, because he knew they were right. In the past, he had never failed to strike a deal when he put himself to the task. But since coming to Disney, he had failed at every turn. Katzenberg left with a warning. "This is just the beginning. You have no idea what you're in for." Unfortunately, they were correct in their summation of Ovitz's reputation. Once known as the man who could strike a deal with anybody, his continued failures to do so at Disney had not gone unnoticed in the media. Ovitz had been a bit of a media darling, perhaps due partially to the fact that he represented so many of Hollywood's most powerful and popular actors and creatives. But since coming to Disney, the media was more comfortable using a critical and cutting tone towards Ovitz. The longer he remained at Disney, the less credibility he had. Rumors of the rift between himself and Eisner found their way into headline after headline, and in multiple quotes, as well as an appearance on The Larry King Show, Eisner had tried to dismiss such rumors. However, he never went out of his way to compliment Ovitz or outline his strengths, causing further speculation. Ovitz had worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week to try to achieve something at Disney. But instead, everybody seemed to tally every issue against him, no matter how big or small. Even his work ethic was seen in a negative light. At one point, Jane Eisner called Ovitz on the phone, saying, quote, "I wanted you to go to Disney so Michael wouldn't have to work so hard. You're there Saturdays, Sundays. He can't keep up." Ovitz was confused. "What are you talking about? He doesn't have to keep up. It's causing him stress. If you're there, he feels he has to be there." Clearly, Eisner saw Ovitz as a competitor, an enemy that he had to overcome, rather than a partner, as he had promised Ovitz would be. In the midst of all this, it would be fair to question why Eisner kept Ovitz at Disney if he was such a mismatch for the company. When shareholder Sid Bass asked if he could just fire Ovitz, Eisner said he had already made plans to do so, but was waiting, because he was worried Ovitz might take his own life if he was fired. Now, this might seem like a strange thing for Eisner to say, and that's because it is. It's a very strange thing for Eisner to say. It's anybody's guess why he would make such a claim. Eisner later said that the subject matter was just on his mind after he and Ovitz went to see Rent on Broadway, in which a character takes his own life, but that doesn't really explain it. Perhaps Eisner had developed a strange relationship with the concept of self-harm after he saw someone throw themselves off the roof of the University of Notre Dame years prior. Or perhaps there was a more logical explanation, at least more logical than those other reasons. Eisner and Ovitz were still seeing each other socially in the middle of all this. Their families were still very close. While Ovitz and Eisner were butting heads over and over at Disney, in their regular lives, they were still best friends. So perhaps Eisner was less worried about Ovitz actually hurting himself, and more worried about the death of their friendship. Regardless, Eisner saw Ovitz as a problem, and knew he would eventually have to fire him. The only question was how to do so in a way that reflected best on the company. The ongoing litigation with Katzenberg and the consistent negative press aimed at Eisner were hurting the reputation of Disney. Losing Ovitz so soon after bringing him in would inevitably look bad for the company, so they had to figure out how to minimize the damage. And luckily, Eisner had a solution. One of the few departments that Eisner had let Ovitz take the reins with was Hollywood Records, Disney's music division. Ovitz had proposed merging the division with Sony's music division, and arranged a meeting with Sony executives, himself, and Eisner. During the meeting, the Sony executives made a point to compliment Ovitz, saying to Eisner, quote, "You're so lucky to have him. Good managers are hard to find." Eisner was uninterested in the proposed merger, and was annoyed that the dinner took 3 hours to wrap up. But after hearing the praise that the Sony executives sang for Ovitz, Eisner suddenly had an idea. If he could get Ovitz to go to Sony, it would look less like Disney had fired him, and more like he had just found a better opportunity elsewhere. After dinner, Eisner began planting the thought in Ovitz's mind. "They really like you. I bet they'd hire you." He was not exactly being subtle, and Ovitz's heart sank knowing Eisner was trying to get rid of him. "You could run their operations here in the US. It's a great idea for you." I'll think about it," Ovitz responded, downtrodden. He knew that his days were numbered if Eisner had his way, and Eisner certainly planned to have things his way. He quickly went to work addressing the problem with members of the board, writing a letter to Irwin Russell, Ray Watson, and Stanley Gold. He outlined his dissatisfaction with Ovitz's performance, and why in his opinion he could not possibly serve as a successor of any kind. He further stated that Ovitz, quote, "seems manic, and for many reasons is ill-equipped to lead the Walt Disney Company. The company simply cannot make him CEO. It would be catastrophic. I hate saying that, but his strength of personality, together with his erratic behavior and pathological problems, and I hate saying that, is a mixture leading to disaster for this company. The mistake was mine, totally and completely. Maybe I suspected it at the time, but my desire to bring in a strong number 2 executive, my desire to satisfy my wife's honest request that I get help, my desire to appear not threatened by strong executives, my desire to seek experienced help to run ABC, and my desire to do what was right for Disney, all clouded my basic instinct that I was making a mistake. Michael Ovitz does not have the trust of anybody. I do not trust him. Michael Ovitz has not taken any workload off me. He is work. It is necessary to check on everything he does. I had hoped it was me, that I was dealing badly with some kind of Shakespearean threat from inside the company. It is not. Michael Ovitz simply is not a corporate executive." Knowing that the board would be frustrated that, yet again, they found the company without anybody in line as a successor, Eisner suggested Bob Iger would be a suitable candidate to replace him. But immediately after suggesting him, Eisner listed out many of Iger's perceived faults, and the frustrations Eisner and team felt in dealing with him. He suggested that if Iger should take the throne, the board should create spending limits and restrictions of power for him. Clearly, he did not want to present Iger as the ideal future leader of the Magic Kingdom. Eisner could not address his plans to get rid of Ovitz at an actual board meeting, since Ovitz would be attending, but he made sure to make his grievances known to every member of the board one by one. Soon, everybody was on the same page, and all that remained was for Eisner to pull the trigger. Soon after, Ovitz was taking a phone call in his office when Sandy Litvak came downstairs and walked right in. Ovitz continued his call, trying to ignore Litvak's unwavering stare, but he finally hung up and acknowledged him. "How can I help you?" "You can't help me," Litvak said, sitting across from Ovitz with a smug demeanor. "I'm here to tell you that Michael doesn't want you in the company. You're being terminated." Ovitz felt as if the floor had fallen from beneath him. He looked away from Litvak, hiding the deep hurt he felt. Not only was Eisner pushing him out, but he did not have the decency to say it to his face. His best friend. Ovitz went to Eisner's office and confronted him. "How could you?" Eisner sat in silence, not having an answer. Eventually, he said, "We need to resolve this. We need to put a good face on this." Ovitz was furious and stood up for himself. "Well, I'm not going anywhere. You made a lot of promises to me before I came here. I'm still learning. You can't cut this off right now. You can't fire me. You've got to give me more time to integrate. I'm not giving up on this." And still, no response from Eisner. Ovitz added a final jab, saying, quote, "I'm just finally understanding how this place runs." Ovitz stared down at Eisner, but received no response, so he left. Despite putting his foot down and refusing to leave, Eisner began reaching out to Sony himself, pretending he wanted to keep Ovitz as a means of manipulating them into wanting him. Eisner later summarized these communications, quote, "I was actually talking to Sony myself, telling them that I would be very reluctant to lose Michael Ovitz, that they would have to pay 100% of the compensation that Disney owed him, and that I was only doing it because Michael Ovitz, you can't really keep a number 2 man from being number 1, and that they would have to give us some deal, record deal or something. I was trying to make Sony believe that this was the last thing in the world that I wanted to do." So not only was Eisner trying to trick them into taking Ovitz off his hands, he was trying to strike a deal that would be favorable to Disney in the process. Ovitz went to meet again with the Sony executives. They were cordial and offered a deal, but Ovitz characterized it as a non-offer offer, something meant to show respect and interest in Ovitz, but also indicating they did not necessarily want to take him. Ovitz did not care, however, as he meant what he said about not leaving Disney. He returned home and wrote Eisner a note saying, quote, "I have decided to end the negotiations and recommit myself to you and Disney." Eisner was distraught. His hopes of saving face were fading fast, as Ovitz, in his own words, planned to chain himself to the desk. And not only was Ovitz holding on for dear life, he was hatching a plan to convince Eisner to let him stay. Eisner and Ovitz's families were planning to travel to Aspen to celebrate Ovitz's 50th birthday on December 14th. Ovitz, having nowhere else to go and desperate to change his fortunes at Disney, began putting together an elaborate presentation listing his achievements during his time at the company. He planned to pull Eisner aside, make his case, and upon changing his friend's mind, extend his tenure at the company and gain another chance to redeem himself. All he had to do was hang on for a few more months. He knew it would work. It had to. "I'm a very tenacious guy," he later said. "They weren't going to stop me. I was going to make this work. I knew if I could get through the middle of December and I made my presentation that he would give me the time that I needed to do it. Since we were best friends for all those years, I actually expected him to do it. And I thought he had an obligation to the company to take the shot to let me do it because you can't decide if someone can do something on a macro basis in 11 months. Around Thanksgiving, Eisner brought Ovitz into his office to negotiate his settlement. Ovitz was agreeable, and the meeting was productive, but all along, Ovitz believed he would still be able to redeem himself. He was so close to Aspen, so close to his presentation, and seemingly so close to winning Eisner back. And it was only 3 days before leaving for the trip that Eisner again summoned Ovitz to a meeting. When Ovitz walked in, he was handed his own resignation, a press release announcing his departure from the company, quote, "by mutual consent." He was shell-shocked. Later, he remembered very little of the conversation. Only one moment stood out. At the end, when Eisner said he hoped the situation wouldn't affect their personal relationship. Eisner mentioned how excited himself and Jane were to host Ovitz's birthday party in just a couple days. But when Ovitz's birthday came 2 days later, there was no party, there was no cake, and there were no presents opened. Instead, Ovitz chose to stay home with his wife. Once a great socialite, a great businessman, an incredible deal maker. He was at the top of the world in Hollywood, and he left to work alongside his best friend at the Magic Kingdom, only for Eisner to push him out just 16 months later. Ovitz could not believe that after everything, Eisner still thought they could remain friends. He was wrong. One executive who had seemed to fall away from Eisner's watchful eye was Steve Burke. Burke had been running the Disney store chain, leading to large profits and widespread success, when Eisner decided to switch things up. Eisner had a philosophy that a good manager can run any kind of business, and assigned Burke as manager of Euro Disneyland. Burke had been hesitant to leave the Disney stores, enjoying his position there, but the prospect of managing a Disney theme park was undoubtedly enticing. Unfortunately, Euro Disneyland was not doing very well upon opening. The park had been recently renamed Disneyland Paris, and although it was still underperforming financially, it had been restructured to be more stable for the time being. Still, it was a stain on Eisner's track record, and he tended to ignore it, focusing on bigger projects. As his children were beginning to reach school age, Burke expressed interest in moving back to the US and transitioning to a different role at the company. Eisner had promised to bring Burke back at some point, but kept blowing him off whenever asked. But while Eisner had seemed content to overlook Burke, he had caught the attention of Katzenberg, who called and asked to meet in Paris. When they sat down together, Katzenberg cut right to the chase, asking Burke to come to DreamWorks. Burke was surprised and flattered, but hesitant. "I feel a lot of loyalty towards Michael," he said. Katzenberg gave him a warning. "I promise you, someday that will change. Michael Eisner has no loyalty to you." "Yes, he does," Burke said, but Katzenberg continued. "Let me tell you something. Fundamentally, Michael doesn't care about anybody else. Maybe his wife, but all Michael cares about is Michael." In 1997, Eisner was presented with a new 10-year contract. In this new deal, Eisner's base pay would remain the same at $750,000 annually, but his bonus formula and stock options were increased, allowing him to make more money by the end of the 10-year period. Notably, the contract outlined that if Eisner was ever dismissed from his position, he would be entitled to a full cash payout of the remaining value of his contract, further securing his future at the company. By this point, Eisner had accumulated enough stocks to become the second highest individual shareholder, higher than Roy or Diane Disney, and only falling below the Basses. When Eisner's contract was completed, he exercised some of his stock options for $545 million, making him once again the highest paid executive in America. And Eisner was not the only one pulling from the mouse's wallet. The termination of Ovitz had reportedly cost the company around $140 million once a settlement was reached. And the ongoing court battle between Disney and Katzenberg was costing Disney more and more each time Eisner refused to make a deal. Money was flying all over the place at the Magic Kingdom, and too much was going towards all of the missteps and failures Eisner had made along the way. So it might be fair to ask, why was he getting so much money? Well, the new contract was put together by board member Erwin Russell, who also happened to be Eisner's personal lawyer. This should be a clear conflict of interest, but nobody ever seems to have brought that issue up. And the reason for that was because practically every member of the board at this point in time was beholden to Eisner in one way or another. Here are a few examples of board members and their various allegiances to Eisner. Revita Bowers was the principal for the Center for Early Education, a school in West Hollywood that Eisner and many Disney executives sent their children to, and supported with large donations. Similarly, Leo O'Donovan was the president of Georgetown University, where Eisner's son Breck graduated from, and Eisner continued to support with donations. Robert Stern was Eisner's personal architect. George Mitchell's law firm earned hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees from representing Disney. There were those, such as Sandy Litvak, who actually fell under Eisner's leadership in the company, and of course were loyal to him as a result. And recently, Eisner had brought on a new board member, Andrea Van de Kamp. Van de Kamp was the chairman of the Los Angeles Music Center. The center had been working with Lillian Disney, Walt's widow, to create the Walt Disney Concert Hall, meant to celebrate Walt's love of music. Lillian had donated $50 million, but Van de Kamp and her team quickly realized that that would not be enough, and reached out to the company for help. Eisner did not care for the project, but after months of lobbying to meet with him, Van de Kamp finally got to sit down with Eisner. "Are we here to talk about a movie?" he asked. "Because I'm against the Walt Disney Concert Hall." Van de Kamp shot back. "Should I leave now, or can I finish my coffee?" Eisner laughed, and with that, she got to work convincing him to rally the board to provide financial support for the project. Eisner was hesitant, But Van de Kamp was smart, tapping into Eisner's love for architecture and impressing him with her presentation skills and persuasiveness. In the end, she got what she needed. Eisner stood to leave, but suddenly got an idea. He turned back. "You're a good salesman. Maybe you should work here." And within a few months, she became a member of the board. Another member who, perhaps in his view, owed Eisner to some degree. At this stage, there were very few left to oppose Eisner's choices. There were those such as Roy and Gold, as well as Card Walker before he retired, who occasionally pushed for Eisner to name his successor, as he had failed to do repeatedly. But now, it seemed that Eisner had dropped any pretense of trying to do so. The company once again had no president, but Eisner seemed to be in no hurry to fill that slot. Litvak and Roth were floated as potential options, but Eisner shot both of them down. He was at the top of the company, the sole king of the Magic Kingdom, and he was not planning to relinquish that power anytime soon. Meanwhile, as Disney was spending its money on Eisner and the messes he had helped cause, the company itself was on a downward trend. Euro Disneyland had been a massive failure that continued to lose the company millions of dollars and hold the entire parks division back. Meanwhile, a string of live-action failures forced the company to restructure Touchstone Pictures and Hollywood Pictures to all work under Buena Vista Distribution and to reduce output altogether. ABC continued to have issues creating a solid lineup of programming, and the company was moved from New York to Los Angeles, to the frustration of Bob Iger. And worse, the Disney Renaissance was quickly coming to a close. After The Lion King came Pocahontas, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and Hercules, which all paled in comparison both financially and critically. The release of Tarzan a few years later would officially be the end of the renaissance of Disney animation, and the declining interest in the company's films meant the consumer products division was suffering as well. Disney stores began shuttering their doors one by one, as without a hit film with a hit cast of marketable characters, there were less toys to sell. The only films that seemed to be doing well were projects released in partnership with Pixar. But Steve Jobs, chairman of the board at Pixar, was finding Eisner impossible to work with. The two companies had worked out an agreement to create a set amount of films together. But after the success of Toy Story and Toy Story 2, Eisner insisted that sequels would not count per their agreement, meaning they would have to make more films than they expected with Disney. Jobs balked at this, and refused to negotiate further with Eisner, indicating an oncoming divorce of the two companies. This seemed to be the worst thing for Disney. If their own films were failing, why would they want to cut ties with the group contributing to their greatest successes? But Eisner's anger with Jobs led him to badmouth the company to the Disney board, saying that the oncoming release of Finding Nemo would be a rude awakening for Pixar, as Eisner did not think it was any good. But Eisner's feud with Jobs was nothing compared to his ongoing battle with Katzenberg. Katzenberg refused a settlement of $117 million, wanting instead to force Eisner to go to court and testify. Disney had not anticipated that Katzenberg's legal team would subpoena the notes taken by Tony Schwartz for Eisner's autobiography. These notes detailed Eisner's exact feelings regarding Katzenberg every single time they had an issue, and provided insight into many things the company did not want to be known. Worst of all was Project Snowball, the secret operation meant to calculate how much it would cost to get rid of Katzenberg. Katzenberg's lawyer, Burt Fields, questioned Eisner on the stand. Eisner maintained he had never heard of Project Snowball, and this had to be an initiative put into motion by Wells before his passing, but Katzenberg's legal team was not buying it. "You never heard or saw the name Project Snowball?" Fields questioned. "No, not that I recall." But when Fields handed Eisner a memo addressed to him, titled Project Snowball, it was hard to deny his involvement. Still, Eisner played dumb. "I don't think I ever saw this memo." Fields handed him another memo, titled Project Snowball, Highly Confidential, from Frank and Cheryl F. to Michael Eisner. "You didn't see that one either?" Eisner maintained his ignorance, but Fields continued, asking further embarrassing and revealing questions. "Did you consider yourself the cheerleader, and Mr. Katzenberg merely the tip of your pom-pom?" "No." "Didn't you say that to Mr. Schwartz? That's how you looked at him?" "Mr. Schwartz had that in his notes, I believe. I don't think I ever said it. If I said it, I'm quite sure it was in humor." "You don't think Mr. Schwartz made that up, do you?" Eisner was finding himself backed into a corner. I don't know." "Do you think he made it up?" "Probably not." "So you probably said it. In humor." This was embarrassing for Eisner, but nothing compared to the next question. Did you tell Mr. Schwartz that you hated Mr. Katzenberg? In one conversation when he pushed me on things that Katzenberg had done, I did say that. You said, quote, I think I hate that little mutt. Eisner grew uncomfortable. He tried to protest that his personal feelings towards Katzenberg did not belong in the public record, but Fields cut him off. Didn't you say on more than one occasion that you hated Mr. Katzenberg to Mr. Schwartz? I probably did hundreds and hundreds of hours of interviewing Mr. Schwartz, probably out of humor, out of gross unpleasantness. Eisner continued on, claiming he did not hate Katzenberg and that this line of questioning was in nobody's best interest. But Fields ignored this and asked his final question. Did you say to Mr. Schwartz, I don't care what he thinks, I am not going to pay him any of the money? I would say again, in anger, I said that. And with that, Fields rested his case. Eisner's team quickly rallied to his defense, providing context to each comment which they hoped would dispel any controversy. But Eisner was right about one thing. Katzenberg had a talent for playing to the media, and the media had little concern over Eisner's defense. The colorful and offensive insults Eisner had thrown at Katzenberg made sensational headlines, while internally, Eisner had made numerous steps to secure his power at the top of the company. Outside of the business, people were beginning to question his leadership. After all, Disney had always been known as a family-focused company, and had tried to maintain a cleaner image than most studios. But with their dirty laundry being aired out in court, the magic of the Magic Kingdom faded just a little bit. These quotes lent the public insight into the rule of a bitter king, who trampled those who stood in his way. By the time the settlement was reached, Disney owed Katzenberg $280 million, a far cry from the $60 million he had asked for in the beginning. Eisner's stubbornness and refusal to negotiate, despite pressure from Geffen and Ovitz, had cost Disney far too much, for no reason at all. Despite having so many in the board on his side, pressures from Wall Street and the media could not be ignored forever. Once again, Stanley Gold raised the question of naming a successor, along with Tom Murphy and a few other board members. ABC was finally on the upswing with the success of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and Bob Iger was looking like the ideal candidate. Eisner became irate when questioned, however, and chose to launch into a tirade listing the many weaknesses of Iger. Iger can never succeed me, he said, pointing out that Iger was hardly the creative type, and lacked the stature to lead a company such as Disney. Tom Murphy, seeing how Eisner really felt about Iger, warned him, prompting Iger to consider leaving in the following year. But despite his clear resistance, Eisner felt enough pressure to discuss the possibility of naming Iger as the new president. Iger had been pining for the position for some time, but when finally being given consideration for the job, Iger hesitated. Are you sure? He asked. You seem to be hot and cold on me. Eisner was taken aback. It was rare for someone in the company to be so candid with him. He did not answer the question right away, but later at dinner with their wives, Eisner revealed his true feelings on the matter. Every time I think of naming a president, I feel like I'm competing with myself. Iger became agitated. That's ridiculous. I'm not trying to take your job. It's enough to be president of the Walt Disney Company. Despite his fear of losing power or competing with a successor, Eisner relented, naming Bob Iger the president and COO of the company in early 2000. And this caused quite a stir within the executive team. It turns out that when somebody surrounds themselves with a group of people all hoping for a promotion, promises them all the same promotion, and gives it to someone they all hardly knew was in the running, that does not go over very well. Among those who felt jilted was Sandy Litvak. Long had he done Eisner's bidding at every turn. He was the one sent to tell Ovitz to get out, and had put up with Eisner's nonsense during the Katzenberg trial. But in the end, it meant nothing. I always felt like I wanted to be a member of Michael's club, Litvak said of the matter, and then I discovered there wasn't any club. Peter Schneider planned to resign upon hearing the news, telling Joe Roth of his plans, only to find Roth felt similarly. I wouldn't if I were you. I'm going to resign and then you can have the damn job. So around the time Iger was named second in command at Disney, Litvak, Roth, Schneider, and more in the executive team left the company. Iger had won the battle, but he would still have to contend with Eisner's competitive, petty, and temperamental nature. Soon after the announcement was made, the two of them made an appearance at a media event. But Eisner refused to be pictured with Iger at any point during the night. Why would he want to be seen with his competitor, after all? During a company retreat, Disney brought in an outside consultant to interview each executive about their experience in the company and identify any strengths and weaknesses in the team. The goal was to help enhance synergy and teamwork. But only a few interviews in, the consultant quickly saw that the Disney executive team had a massive problem. In the interviews, some were closed off, offering as little of their opinions as possible. Some sugarcoated their feelings, suspecting that the consultant would be reporting the results directly to Eisner. But there were a few bold enough to state the obvious. The team did not trust one another, and the root of that distrust was Eisner himself. After collecting the data from each interview, the consultant nervously prepared to present his results to the team. The results of my research indicate that you guys are not a good team. You're not a team at all. You're not even a group. The men who were less than a group sat in awkward silence. Eisner scoffed. How can you say that? You haven't been to my Monday lunches, he said, referring to his weekly staff meetings. With the silence broken, the men quickly launched into arguments with one another, some insisting that they were a team, and others pointing out that they obviously were not. The consultant sat there, presumably wondering if anybody had noticed that they were proving his point. Later, some commented further on the obvious issues. One summed up the issue well, saying, quote, "What Michael likes is to put 6 pit bulls together and see which 5 die." Clearly, the Disney executive team had a company culture that was rotten to its core, and the rot had run from branch to branch, all spreading from one bad apple, Michael Eisner. Under Eisner's leadership, the company had quickly been taking a turn for the worse culturally and also financially. Eisner had recently decided that Disney should purchase another cable network, Fox Family, despite the fact that they were struggling with ABC. This cost around $5 billion, and after struggling to find success on the network, Disney quickly realized that they had massively overpaid. And the decisions made by Eisner and his team seemed to defy logic. After the failure of Disneyland Paris, Eisner had gone ahead opening a second gate, Disney Studios. The park was tiny compared to those that came before it, with very few rides available on opening day. Van de Kamp voiced some concerns to the rest of the board. There's not enough substance to keep people here for a full day. People are already leaving, and the park has only been open for a few hours. It was only a few minutes before Eisner had heard what Van de Kamp had said, and made a beeline straight towards her. I understand you've been griping. Eisner could afford to treat his fellow executives in this manner, since he had not only most of the board members on his side, but he had long held the favor of the largest individual shareholders, the Bass family. Over the years, the Bass family had each gone their separate ways, but each maintained a substantial hold in the company. Eisner had impressed the family when he launched Disney from fading relevance to a financial giant. Together, Eisner and the Basses held a controlling stake in Disney. As long as Eisner had the Basses on his side, he had little reason to worry about gaining the favor of other shareholders or even many of those in the company. But that all changed when Eisner received a shocking phone call from Sid Bass. The stock market was continuing to sink lower and lower, as a recession was sure to happen soon. Worse, the Disney stock had dropped substantially from the highs of the Eisner era. This put the Bass family in a position where they felt they had to sell off their shares in Disney, a collective 6.4% stake. Eisner was shocked. He had been close with the Basses ever since the beginning, and without them, he knew his grip on the power structure of Disney would inevitably loosen. The company was forced to buy back 50 million shares to protect their interests, costing them more money that they had no business spending. However, there were still a few branches free from Eisner's control, including a branch that ran straight to the roots of the company itself, Roy Disney Jr. Roy had brought Eisner and Wells into the company at a time when it was in immediate danger of being bought and scrapped for parts. And this proved to be a wild success, not only saving the company from takeover, but allowing the company to reach new heights they could have only dreamed of. Disney had gone from a studio fading from relevancy to a massive player in Hollywood. But Eisner, in the absence of Wells, had felt like less of a lucky charm for the company than he used to be. Wells had been involved in a number of missteps in the company, such as Euro Disneyland and Project Snowball. But regardless, it was clear that Wells's death, as well as Eisner's heart surgery, served as a dividing line between when times were good and times were bad. Looking at the company as a whole, since 1995 they had been steadily declining in profits. Roy began to voice his concerns to Stanley Gold, fearing Eisner would lead the company into the same precarious position he had found it in, and Gold was beginning to develop concerns of his own. As the chairman of the Executive Compensation Committee, Gold had been presented with a $9 million contract for Stu Bloomberg, who had been leading ABC's primetime schedule. While the network had found success with Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, the program faded from relevance after it was overscheduled and surrounded with less popular shows. Eisner and Iger had been heavily involved in many decisions regarding ABC, and it could be fair to point fingers at them, rather than Bloomberg, who was just following orders. Either way though, it seemed odd to provide Bloomberg with a lucrative contract when the network he was in charge of programming was failing because of its terrible programming. During a dinner meeting with Eisner and the Compensation Committee, Gold voiced his frustrations to his fellow directors in confidence, criticizing the contract and Disney's performance in general. But as the dinner ended and everybody got up to leave, Eisner pulled Gold aside. His face was bright red. He had heard about Gold's complaining, and he was furious. "You're talking to everybody. You're causing trouble. Everybody tells me you're upset." Once again, it seemed that Eisner had eyes and ears everywhere, but Gold stood firm. "I'm just talking to other directors, and I am upset. Your behavior is outrageous." But Gold again stood firm. It was his job to make decisions on how much people should be paid, and more broadly, to speak up about issues he saw within the company. But Eisner cut straight to the point. "Are you saying you're losing confidence in me? Are the two of you?" He knew that even if Roy was not there, Gold represented him in spirit. "Because if you are, then I'll resign. Is that what you want?" Eisner had made the promise all those years ago to leave when asked, but Gold knew Roy was not ready to make such an earth-shattering decision. Not yet. "No, but I'm getting close." Bloomberg was fired soon after receiving his lucrative contract, which cost the company more money it had no reason to spend. So in the end, it seemed Gold had been right to be concerned, and Eisner, seeing the voices of dissent growing louder, was growing concerned himself. Eisner could see that many on the board, empowered by his shrinking hold of power on the company, were feeling more comfortable raising concerns and questioning his authority. Worse, many outside of the board began to question the independence of its members. So many had either been tied to Eisner personally or profiting off the company significantly that it was becoming harder to ignore. So Gold, seizing his opportunity, began to call for a structural reform. It harkened back to the reform he had called for in the past, which led to the ousting of Ron Miller. The similarity was certainly not lost on Eisner, but Eisner, who was fed up with Gold undermining him, decided that perhaps a reform could work in his favor. Disney teamed up with an outside firm, led by Ira Milstein, to help identify any conflicts of interest in the company and restructure the company in a way that prevented this. From the outside, that sounds like the perfect plan. But on the inside, Gold and Roy knew this may be a problem. Eisner had so many people on his side that they worried he would be able to work the restructuring in a way that ousted anybody who opposed him. And when the firm's results came out, it seems that their fears were correct. They found that Stanley Gold was no longer considered an independent because his daughter held a job in consumer products. A permanent ruling would be held later to make a final determination about whether or not Gold could keep his job as the chairman of the Governance and Nominating Committee, as well as the Compensations Committee. But in the meantime, he would have to share his position with Eisner loyalist George Mitchell. Mitchell, remember, was the one who had earned $2 million through his law firm's work with Disney, a pretty apparent conflict of interest that nobody seemed to question. It was clear that Eisner wanted Gold out, and there was a looming threat that those who opposed him would be kicked out as well. It was around this time that the media began to catch wind of the rift between Eisner and Gold, along with Roy. Eisner accused Gold of going to the press, which he denied. Eisner insisted he wanted to keep their differences behind closed doors, and Gold agreed. But Gold became frustrated when he found that Ray Watson, one of the board members who had been considering pushing for Eisner's resignation, praised the CEO in the press. Quote, "We have no interest in going out and bringing an unknown into this company and this difficult industry when we believe we already have the best CEO in the business." To Gold, it was clear that Eisner had directed him to say this, and that Watson was not as willing to stand up to Eisner as he had initially seemed. And worse, in Gold's view, Eisner was controlling the narrative by only presenting his side of the story. So Gold drafted a letter to the directors, in which he criticized Watson for wavering on his opinion of Eisner. Gold referred to the exact lunch where Watson had criticized Eisner, what he said, and just revealed a lot of embarrassing details about how Watson felt. But at the end, Gold referred to a larger failure on the part of the board. "We, the directors, are guilty of not discussing the real issues affecting the company. We have not fully and critically addressed the failed plans of our executives or the broken promises that management had made to the board and the shareholders over the last 5 years. We are too polite, too concerned with hurting each other's feelings, when our real job is A, to protect the shareholders, and B, to coalesce around a management team and a plan that we believe will get us out of our current malaise. I hope you will receive my comments in the spirit in which they are offered. Serious concern by a director who believes that we, the Disney directors, have long been too compliant and uncritical of management's failures. We can no longer accept as fact that all of the bad things that happen to Disney are out of management's control, and all of the good things are a result of having, quote, the best CEO in the business. Kindest personal regards, Stanley P. Gold." The letter was harsh, and many wondered if it was the right approach. Van de Kamp in particular felt the letter was perhaps a step too far, and called Iger to discuss it. Iger, being close to Eisner, was experiencing the letter's fallout when he answered the call. "We're really upset. Michael is frantic." Intended or not, Eisner saw this as a declaration of battle, and he was quick to fire back. The next day, Disney publicly disclosed that Gold's daughter worked at the company, which was a conflict of interest. But they did not only go after Gold. After the revelation that he had been considering pushing Eisner out, Ray Watson was also named as a non-independent, since his son worked at the company. Notably, some Eisner loyalists were named as well, including Revita Bowers, who was the principal of his children's former school. Under the new structure that Ira Milstein was in the process of developing, Gold and the rest of the named directors could soon be forced to step down. The next week, Eisner and Gold met for lunch. Eisner started off with a cool accusation. "Bruce Orwell told me he spoke to you," Eisner said, referring to a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. But Gold was not going to let that slide. "Let's take a f***ing lie detector test. I have not spoken to Bruce Orwell, so either he's lying or you're lying. Which one is it?" Bruce Orwell later denied ever speaking to Gold. But Eisner moved on from accusations to the real reason for the lunch. Eisner was there to ask Gold to resign from the governance and nominating committee. Gold refused, and instead said he wanted Eisner's resignation. He reminded Eisner that right at the beginning, Eisner had made a promise to leave if Gold or Roy ever asked him to. "I never said that," Eisner said. Gold was stunned. Eisner had said it many times, although it was now clear that he never really meant it. "Let me ask you, Michael, are you going to go out as a gentleman, or are you going to be carried out on your shield?" Eisner stood to leave. "Let me assure you, I'll be here long after you're gone." And with that, the men left, back to their respective sides of the battlefield. With the outside firm's results being revealed, the time was approaching for the board to meet and decide whether or not they should remove those deemed non-independent, as well as hear Eisner present his plan for the coming years of Disney. Before the day of the meeting, Eisner pulled Van de Kamp aside. "If you vote for that side," he said, referring to Roy and Gold, "you're off the board." But Van de Kamp was not intimidated. "Don't be like that. You're just upset. Stanley is not your enemy. He's worried about performance. Present a plan. Give the board a strategy. Tell us what you're going to do to bring us out of this mess. Don't divide us." On September 23, 2002, at 5 p.m., the board met to determine the future of the company. Along with Gold, Roy had made it a point to attend. First, it was time to decide if Gold was to remain as the chairman of the governance and nominating committee. Many Eisner loyalists voted for Gold's removal, but despite Eisner's warning, Van de Kamp resisted. Since the board was unable to come to a consensus, Gold was allowed to remain as temporary co-chairman with George Mitchell for the time being. With that matter decided, Gold stood to make his statement to the board. Gold, along with Roy and their associates at Shamrock, had put together a detailed presentation lining out the issues they saw with Disney. Gold's main point was that from every economic metric, Disney was at a 7-year financial low. He highlighted that in particular, the purchases of ABC and Fox Family had cost the company billions. And worse, Gold presented a side-by-side comparison of management's claims regarding Disney's financial standing to the actual reality of the company's situation. Because so many on the board were beholden to Eisner, he controlled the flow of information, and was able to spin the failures of the company as being less important than they actually were, or somebody else's fault. But it seemed hard to deny dishonesty from Eisner and team when it was shown so clearly. Gold continued to point out that Eisner's plan for the previous 5 years, as presented to the board previously, had fallen below projections further and further as each year passed. Gold also highlighted Disney's continued dependence on the success of Pixar animated movies rather than their own, and noted Eisner's inability to extend their contract. In full, the presentation ran for an hour and a half. It was a comprehensive and damning exploration of the Eisner Era over the past 5 years. Roy had been sitting silently during the presentation, as he usually did during meetings, but both he and Gold expected this to serve as a wake-up call to the board members who had been left in the dark all this time. Gold concluded the presentation and then asked if there were any questions. Silence. Nobody raised a hand. The room felt cold and awkward. Eventually, Tom Stagg stood up to give a rebuttal to Gold's presentation, making the case that Gold was cherry-picking evidence to tarnish Eisner and his team. It was a tough case to make, but the point was not to disprove Gold. Most of the board, who remained silent, were merely concerned with remaining in Eisner's good graces. When Staggs concluded, Gold called for a vote on a management review, a real one this time, but George Mitchell asked Gold to withdraw the request. Gold looked around at the board. It was a room full of those loyal to Eisner. He looked to Eisner, sitting at the head of the table. Gold knew he could not overpower him alone, and so he relented. Eisner stood and gave his own presentation, pointedly ignoring the points that Gold had made beforehand. His action plan was for Disney to focus on the strengths of the brands it held, things like ESPN and ABC, so that they could secure more profits. He wanted to slash spending as a whole and focus on protecting their most lucrative assets. It was not necessarily a bad plan, but it was arguably a half measure, a partial solution, and in the end, it was not about his plan. Eisner was after one thing, and he stated it right after his presentation. Eisner said that due to the recent publicity covering supposed divisions within the board, he wanted everybody to send a message by giving his plan, and Eisner himself, a unanimous vote of confidence. I couldn't vote for that. Heads turned to the other side of the table, shocked to find that Roy, for once, had spoken up. Roy looked pointedly to Eisner. You don't have my support. Eisner's face reddened, boiling over with rage, but just as he was about to fire back, Mitchell asked Eisner, Iger, and the executive branch to leave the room. He wanted the board to discuss the matter privately. In the absence of Eisner and his team, the board had a heated debate. Both Roy and Gold reiterated the points of their presentation and refused to vote in support of Eisner. Mitchell helped the board compromise. They would not vote on Eisner's plan. Instead, they would put together a statement that expressed their, quote, overwhelming support for Eisner. This was just a PR move, and everybody knew it, which is why Mitchell was nervous when he called Eisner back in, only to reveal that they had been unable to vote on his plan. But Eisner cut him off, waving a piece of paper in his hand. I can't live with this, he exclaimed, staring straight at Gold and Roy. They're undermining me, leaking me to the press, and this proves it. While we were in this room, I've been emailed by someone at the LA Times about something we talked about 3 hours ago. He read the paper, which he claimed was an email he received from a reporter urging Eisner for an interview, mentioning that he would be interviewing the other side. Gold tried to deny this, but Eisner shouted over him. Stanley and Roy are trying to get rid of me. They don't think I can run this company. But who do you think can? Bob? Everybody turned to Bob Iger, who looked like a deer caught in headlights. Bob can't run this company. Everybody froze, as Eisner sat down again at the head of the table. Mitchell adjourned the meeting before things could get any worse. It was clear that Eisner would stop at nothing to hold on to his power, even if it meant trampling over those most loyal to him. It was clear to Eisner following the meeting that Gold was not the only board member he needed to worry about. Roy wanted Eisner out just as much as Gold did, and Eisner felt he needed to take steps to minimize his role in the company. Quite an undertaking, considering he was a big shareholder, well liked by the animation department, and also named Roy Disney. It was his family's company, but he was not sitting at the head of the table. Eisner was the king of the Magic Kingdom, and he planned to keep it that way. Eisner first attempted to gain favor with Roy, hoping to create a rift between Roy and Gold. He pulled Roy aside and confronted him. "Roy, I don't understand this. You have a great life. You've made a fortune. I protect you. Why are you doing this?" "I agree with Stanley," Roy stated. The meeting ended very quickly when Roy reminded Eisner of his promise to leave when asked. "I never said that," Eisner insisted, leaving Roy with nothing left to say. So instead, Eisner prepared for battle. He instructed his loyalists within the company to report to him on everything Roy did day to day. Those who visited Eisner's office noticed a massive folder filled with every email Roy had sent or received over the years. Many worried about the things they had said regarding Eisner in those emails, especially the animators, who had long been frustrated by his micromanagement. Next, Eisner instructed animation executive Thomas Schumacher to bar Roy from all animation meetings, and worse, changed the locks to his office in order to exile him from the lot altogether. Schumacher was friends with Roy, and although he had been reporting all their conversations to Eisner, working as a sort of spy, he refused to take such drastic measures to push Roy out of animation. He warned Roy not to attend animation meetings, but Roy, well aware of Eisner's actions against him, was unfazed and went about his work as usual. While Eisner made steps to reduce Roy's power in the company, he continued to work towards pushing Gold out, who he still saw as the real troublemaker. And he had a new excuse for pushing Gold out, one that held more weight. Because Gold was basically the chief executive of Shamrock, which handled Roy's financial holdings, Eisner claimed that Gold was beholden to Roy, making him a non-independent. The hypocrisy was obvious, with many of Eisner's loyalists having more egregiously inappropriate ties to the company. When the motion was brought up, Van de Kamp pointed out how ridiculous the situation was. "You must be kidding. This makes no sense. The shareholders won't accept this." But her opposition fell largely on deaf ears, with only her, Gold, and Roy left to oppose Eisner. It looked like Gold would soon lose his title. But with Van de Kamp on the board, Eisner still had one too many opposing voices to make such drastic changes. She had been brought on after Eisner did her a favor, but clearly Van de Kamp's integrity prevented her from incorporating that into any of her decision-making. The board had recently faced a motion on the idea of splitting the roles of CEO and chairman of the board, which Van de Kamp had supported. Although the motion failed to pass, Eisner knew she needed to go. Just after the start of the new year in 2003, Eisner pulled Van de Kamp into his office. "You're a terrible director," he said right off the bat. "You come late to meetings. You're not prepared. You're too busy." Van de Kamp was stunned. Nobody had ever made such accusations against her. By most accounts, she was a stellar director. But it did not take Eisner long to reveal the real issue he had with Van de Kamp. "You are so loyal to Stanley, it's like you've carried his babies," he said, without shame. Van de Kamp was floored by Eisner's comment, which to her seemed to indicate she was having an affair with Gold. Van de Kamp valued her marriage more than anything, and felt extremely hurt by such a claim. She grabbed hold of Eisner's hand. "Michael, stop this right now. The best thing I have in my life is my marriage. What you're really upset about is that I don't always vote with you. That's the real issue." "It's not that you haven't always voted with me," Eisner insisted. Then, he listed off every single time she had not voted with him. Every single time. More times than Van de Kamp could even remember. Van de Kamp, seeing how petty Eisner really was, decided to take a shot back. "Why don't you show you can lead this company without Frank Wells?" Eisner returned fire. "It's a done deal. The nominating committee has met and has decided not to renominate you. I want you to go on the Disney Foundation board, and I want it to be your idea." Eisner was suggesting that she go to work at the Disney Foundation, which oversees the charitable contributions that Disney makes. But Van de Kamp refused to be pushed out like this, not without a fight. Eisner said that if she did not go, quote, "This will be embarrassing to you and to me." She shot out of her seat. "I'm not embarrassed." "I don't want you talking about this to anyone," Eisner said, "including other directors." But as soon as she left, Van de Kamp sent an email to everyone on the board describing exactly what had happened. She refused to be intimidated into leaving, or pressured into silence. Only Roy and Gold responded to her email, along with Revita Bowers, the principal of the school that Eisner's kids went to. Bowers, seeing more and more who Eisner really was, found herself horrified. Despite not responding to her email, there was quiet chatter amongst the directors, who were worried that Van de Kamp was clearly being purged from the board as a warning to anyone who might oppose Eisner. The official reason was that since Disney financially supported the Walt Disney Concert Hall, her being on the board was a conflict of interest. But that was the whole reason Eisner had brought her on. And besides, the donation predated her coming onto the board, and no donations had happened since. Eisner also accused her of leaking info to the press, which there was no evidence to support. Van de Kamp looked into suing, but unfortunately, there was nothing concrete enough for her to build a solid case against Eisner. It was around this time that she received a call from Gold. "This is going to get ugly tomorrow," he warned. "You can still avoid this if you take the bribe of the foundation job and go quietly." Gold knew the real fight was between him and Eisner, and that Van de Kamp had just been caught in the crossfires. But she refused. She had to set an example and stand up to Eisner, even if nobody could save her. The day before she was due to be potentially voted out, Van de Kamp stormed up to the nominating committee. "The way I've been treated is an abomination," she said. "You should be ashamed of yourselves. Speaking as a former member of this committee, I want you to know that I would never have done this to you." She left, and nobody said a word. The next day, the full board met. Gold moved to reinstate Van de Kamp, which Roy seconded. Sidney Poitier, who rarely spoke up at meetings, voiced support as well. Then, Van de Kamp made her case. "I was asked to serve on this board to be an independent director, and now I'm not being renominated because that's exactly what I am, an independent director. The performance of this company has not been wonderful. I, along with some employees and shareholders, are concerned. Michael Eisner has cost this company a lot of money. $140 million on Michael Ovitz, and this board did nothing. $280 million on Jeffrey Katzenberg. This board did nothing. We have terrible relations with creative people in Hollywood because of Michael Eisner's arrogance. Many of the best executives have left the company. We've just fired all these people, yet Michael Eisner is getting a $5 million bonus. How do those people feel? The process which led to my not being renominated has been outrageous, and we should all be embarrassed. How we've conducted this has been a terrible example, both to ourselves and to the outside world. People look to Disney for leadership, and we have failed them." As soon as Van de Kamp sat back down, Revita Bowers burst into tears. "How can you do this to this distinguished woman?" she pleaded. Finally, it was time for the vote to reinstate Van de Kamp. First Gold, Roy, and Van de Kamp raised their hands. Bowers started to raise hers as well, but Eisner locked eyes with her, daring her to defy him. She thought for a moment, then stood up for what she felt was right, and raised her hand high. Poitier, despite having made a speech on Van de Kamp's behalf, saw Eisner's piercing glare and kept his down, abstaining along with one other member. In total, Van de Kamp received only 4 votes in favor of her staying, with 10 against and 2 abstaining. Despite failing to defeat Eisner, she dutifully served her tenure to the end, quietly leaving her final meeting without a word. With that done, Eisner was able to easily push Gold out of his role as the co-chairman of the Nominating and Governance Committee. He was still on the board, but had lost a critical role and allowed Eisner to further solidify his power. Immediately after, Eisner received his $5 million bonus from the Compensation Committee, while the company was continuing to struggle. The board was almost completely held within Eisner's grasp, but he was still facing scrutiny. The relationship between Pixar and Disney had reached an impasse, with Steve Jobs' refusal to negotiate with Eisner. It looked as if the companies may have to cut ties, which infuriated Gold. "This is bad management. It's abysmal that we're fighting with a creative content partner, and it's abysmal that you've allowed this relationship to deteriorate. It's impossible to negotiate with Steve Jobs, Eisner insisted. Jobs is a Shiite Muslim. Gold and Eisner were about to get into a massive argument until Mitchell stepped in to calm the men down. The board was still seeing the flaws in Eisner's management, and Eisner had had enough of the constant dissent. It was time for his next move, and his next move would be his biggest yet. Soon after the meeting, Roy received a call from fellow board member John Bryson. "I need to talk to you," he said, suggesting they meet somewhere they would not be seen. Roy felt he knew exactly what this was about. The other directors were preparing to fully push Gold off the board. They agreed to meet at a wine bar in Pasadena, and as Roy approached Bryson, he wondered what he could do to protect his friend from losing his seat at the table. The two men ordered drinks, and Bryson cut straight to the point. "You know, Roy, you're past the mandatory retirement age," he said. Roy was floored. This was not about Gold at all. Eisner was pushing Roy out of his own family's company. It was true that Roy was technically past the mandatory retirement age of 72, having recently turned 73, but this rule did not apply to directors who were in a managerial position, such as Roy's role in animation. When Eisner thought of the idea to push Roy off the board, he tested the waters on such a move with his loyalists. He was surprised to find that even amongst all his yes men, he received a lot of resistance to the idea. After all, Roy was a massive shareholder, the vice chairman, and most importantly, the face of Disney to much of the public. Not only did he have the name, but he bore a strong resemblance to his uncle Walt, and was seen by many as the guardian of his family's company, loved by animators and fans alike. But the rule still existed, and Eisner decided it would be the perfect excuse to get Roy out of the company. Bryson mentioned to Roy that two other members who were past 72 years old, Tom Murphy and Ray Watson, would be stepping down as well. "We've concluded that you shouldn't run for re-election," he said. Roy was mostly silent, reeling from the shock that the board would do such a thing. He had dedicated 50 years of his life to the company that his father and uncle built. The company was his namesake, and in many ways, his legacy to inherit. And Eisner, who he had handpicked to sit at the head of the table all those years ago, was exiling him from the magic kingdom that bore his name. "Of course, you can be an honorary director for life," Bryson said. "We'd still like you to show up at the parks, at special events and Roy's laugh caught Bryson off guard. It was clear that the company would not be able to parade Roy around like one of their mascots at the theme parks. He was not Goofy, Donald, or Mickey. He was not the face that resembled Disney. He was Disney. It was his namesake, and it was his kingdom, a kingdom that he knew it was time to take back once again. Roy looked Bryson dead in the eyes as he prepared to leave. "You're making an awful mistake, and you're going to regret doing this." A week before Thanksgiving 2003, Eisner received a call from Bryson. He had assumed that Roy, often quiet and standoffish in meetings, would accept his fate and leave the company with grace. Eisner was distressed to learn that, in fact, Roy had not taken the news well at all. Instantly, Eisner realized he had made a mistake making an enemy in Roy Disney. He picked up the phone to call Gold. "Stanley, I think we need to discuss Roy," Eisner said. "I'm not sure Bryson gave him all the information about this. Maybe it's not a done deal." Gold asked for Bryson to reach out to him. Bryson immediately switched gears, saying that Roy could maybe still be a board member. But Bryson quickly found that there was no turning back. The nomination committee worried that since they had pushed out two other members for being past the age limit, they could open Disney to scrutiny if they allowed Roy to stay. The ball was already in motion, and it seemed nobody could slow its roll, so Eisner and the board doubled down, standing by their decision. Roy met with his advisors at Shamrock, who began analyzing the situation and plotting next steps. But Roy found his mind wandering down into the past. He remembered bringing in Eisner and Wells to save the company from Takeover. He thought back to having to push Ron Miller out of the company Walt had intended for Ron to inherit. He remembered his father's family and his uncle's families being so close, and them being split apart by differences in the company. Business coming between family, splitting the Disneys into two factions. Roy had only made fleeting connections with Diane Disney, his cousin and Walt's daughter, since he ousted her husband Ron all those years ago. But after being cut off from his namesake, Roy felt compelled to reach out and connect with his family once again. Diane answered the phone, surprised to find Roy on the other end. She could hear a twinge of pain in his voice. "I've been asked to step down from the board," Roy admitted. Diane certainly could not have missed the poetic irony. Roy had helped oust her husband all those years ago, and now the same was happening to him. But Diane only felt sorry for Roy. She knew he had been more involved in the company than her or Ron, and knew he did not deserve to have his dedication repaid in that way. "That's terrible. You shouldn't be treated like this." Roy remembered all the whispers circling him in his early days at the company. How Walt had seemed to dislike Roy for his timid nature, perceiving it as a lack of drive. All these years later, and the name they had all called him still echoed in his head. "Well, they'll probably call me the idiot nephew again," he said. "Roy, I want you to know that in our family, that was never said." Perhaps it was never Walt himself who came up with the hurtful moniker. Perhaps he never thought as lowly of his nephew as Roy Jr. had felt over the years. Or perhaps he had, but it no longer mattered. Despite the pain of the broken ties between families, Roy had always done what he could to protect the dream of his father and uncle, and it did not matter if the company tried to push him out. Roy would decide when he was done with his legacy. Roy had led the charge with his Save Disney campaign in the past, helping bring it out from the brink of oblivion. He had saved Disney once, and he knew it was time to do it again. Eisner was enjoying a rare day off at his apartment, watching a football game on the couch. He was anticipating a confrontation of some kind with Gould and Roy soon, expecting some kind of resistance from his decision to push Roy out. But things had been quiet for a couple of days. Maybe he was just blowing smoke before the inevitable end. Maybe things were going perfectly for Eisner, just as he had planned it. Eisner received an email. He walked over to his computer. The email was from Zenia Muka, the chief communications officer. The headline read, quote, "Urgent. Call me. What are we going to do about Roy's resignation?" Roy's resignation? What resignation? Eisner went to type a response, but then something at the door. He walked over to find an envelope had been slid through the doorway. It was a letter from Roy. "Dear Michael, it is with deep sadness and regret that I send you this letter of resignation from the Walt Disney Company, both as chairman of the feature animation division and as vice chairman of the board of directors. You well know that you and I have had serious differences of opinion about the direction and style of management in the company in recent years. For whatever reason, you have driven a wedge between me and those I work with, even to the extent of requiring some of my associates to report my conversations and activities back to you. I find this intolerable. Finally, you discussed with the nominating committee of the board of directors its decision to leave my name off the slate of directors to be elected in the coming year, effectively muzzling my voice on the board, much as you did with Andrea Van de Kamp last year. Michael, I believe your conduct has resulted from my clear and unambiguous statements to you and to the board of directors, that after 19 years at the helm, you are no longer the best person to run the Walt Disney Company. You had a very successful first 10+ years at the company in partnership with Frank Wells, for which I salute you. But since Frank's untimely death in 1994, the company has lost its focus, its creative energy, and its heritage." Roy continued on, naming off the various failures he attributed to Eisner over the last few years. Issues with ABC, the theme parks, Disney's relationship with Pixar, then more overarching issues, such as Eisner's micromanagement and contribution to an overall loss of morale, as well as his failure to name a successor. "Michael, it is my sincere belief that it is you who should be leaving and not me. Accordingly, I once again call for your resignation or retirement. The Walt Disney Company deserves fresh, energetic leadership at this challenging time in its history. just as it did in 1984 when I headed a restructuring which resulted in your recruitment to the company. I had and will always have an enormous allegiance and respect for this company, founded by my uncle, Walt, and father, Roy, and to our faithful employees and loyal stockholders. I don't know if you and the other directors can comprehend how painful it is for me and the extended Disney family to arrive at this decision. With sincere regret, Roy E. Disney. The letter would have to be disclosed to shareholders, and therefore to the media, which would reveal that the rumored tensions between Roy and Eisner were true after all. One might have expected Eisner to feel shocked, frustrated, nervous, or disappointed that his plan was not going the way he expected. But Eisner felt relieved, at peace with the fact that he no longer had to hide these issues behind closed doors. This was far from over. With this letter, Roy was taking the battle to the streets, and Eisner, fueled with adrenaline, was ready for war. Bob Iger received a call from Eisner, ordering Iger and the others to rally and meet him at his apartment. When they arrived, the team first turned to George Mitchell to draft a statement in response to Roy. It was decided that the best course of action was to keep Eisner's name out of the response. That way, it would paint Roy's letter less as an accurate attack on Eisner's character and more as him lashing out on the company as a whole. Essentially, they were giving Roy as little to work with as possible by responding only to the reason behind Roy's departure from the company, that his age required him to leave, even though again, his role as a manager exempted him from this. Eisner's apartment turned into the central battle station, where lawyers, executives, and PR consultants all joined to strategize over the course of the week. But despite all of the preparation, Eisner felt Roy had little to stand on. After all, despite Disney dropping in value, there was no prospect of a corporate takeover like there had been in 1984. And Ron Miller was no Michael Eisner. Eisner was going to be a lot harder for Roy to get rid of. The team did find themselves with one central issue: Gold, who was still a board member. It would be difficult to talk about the Roy situation in a board meeting, since Gold was clearly loyal to Roy. They needed to get rid of him somehow, but were unsure of how to do so. Funnily enough, on the other side of the battlefield at Shamrock, Roy and Gold's team were discussing the same issue. Gold was in an interesting situation. On one hand, Gold would have a clear view from the inside on the company's standing, both in terms of finance and strategy. That kind of insider information could be massively helpful to Roy's cause, except that Gold, as a board member, was under strict confidentiality agreements. This meant that he would have all the info Roy needed, but would be unable to share it with him. While it seemed on the surface that Gold was in a perfect position to help Roy from the inside, being on the board actually held Gold back from helping Roy at all. Gold had worked alongside Roy for 15 years to champion his cause, and he knew exactly what he had to do to help his friend. Gold released a statement, reading, quote, "It is with regret that I resign effective immediately, and second Roy Disney's call for the removal of Michael Eisner as chairman and CEO. Gold, never shy about his feelings, outlined exactly why he thought the board had pushed Roy out. The real reason for the committee's action is that Roy has become more pointed and vocal in his criticism of Michael Eisner and this board. This is yet another attempt by this board to squelch dissent by hiding behind the veil of good governance. What a curious result. The board seems determined to devote its time and energies to adopting policies that only serve to muzzle and isolate those directors who recognize that their role is to be active participants in shaping the company and planning for executive succession. Further, this board isolates those directors who believe that Michael Eisner, when measured by the dismal results over the last 7 years, is not up to the challenge." The response from those within the company was swift. The animation department had a great deal of respect for Roy, and little for Eisner and his team, so they collectively penned a letter in support of Roy and his cause. They thanked Roy for protecting their department when it was in danger of being shut down, and attributed its financial successes to Roy's continued involvement. They outlined that despite all of the critical and financial wins during the Disney Renaissance, animators were never allowed into executive positions. In the new corporate template, we became little more than factory workers or unskilled laborers at the studio we had helped rebuild. Micromanagers from outside the medium fostered a highly toxic work environment, spawning a creative malaise that continues unchecked. They identified Eisner as someone incapable of fostering the legacy of Walt Disney, and someone undeserving of the massive paychecks he had been receiving. Without Roy, they said, who will protect the 70-year Disney legacy from becoming no more than a hollow brand? The letter was released, and within 2 weeks, had been signed by 4,500 former and current Disney animators, nearly every single one. If this was the first battle in the war between Eisner and Roy, it seemed that Roy had claimed the first victory. There was a clear resentment towards Eisner from the animators that had been growing steadily over the years, and Eisner, upon reading this letter, announced that Disney would be shutting down the Orlando animation division. Meanwhile, Pixar and Disney failed to reach an agreement to continue making films together, resulting in their relationship officially dissolving. Steve Jobs, chairman at Pixar, reached out to Roy. He lamented that Disney was the right partner for Pixar, but said, "I can never make a deal with Disney as long as Michael Eisner is there." Roy was determined to make things right between the two companies, and made Jobs a promise. "When the Wicked Witch is dead," he said, "we'll be together again." The messy public exit of Roy and Gold showed clear instability from within the Walt Disney Company, and other companies began to take notice. Comcast began to consider the prospect of buying the company themselves, and reached out to George Mitchell to broach the subject with Eisner. Mitchell, caught in the middle of a crisis at Disney, seemed open to the idea as a way out of their predicament, and approached Eisner about opening negotiations with Comcast. Eisner declined to take any meeting, and Mitchell instead told Comcast to write a letter expressing their interest in purchasing Disney. Steve Burke, who had left Disney to become an executive at Comcast, hesitated to do so. Mitchell was a skilled negotiator as a politician, but he was new to the world of corporate mergers. Comcast was talking to an intermediary, who was talking to Mitchell, who was talking to Eisner. Burke knew that a letter from Comcast would have to be public, and would essentially be a bid for Disney. And since they were negotiating through a corporate game of telephone, Burke wanted to make sure that everybody was on board. But Mitchell insisted it was a good idea to send a letter. After much preparation, the time came for Comcast to release their letter and essentially place a bid for Disney. CEO Brian Roberts, still nervous about any sort of miscommunication, instructed one of Comcast's investment bankers to call Mitchell one more time. Mitchell insisted they had a green light. "We see this as a positive thing," he said. "We'll look at it carefully." But just before pulling the trigger on the offer, Roberts decided to call Eisner directly. After all, they wanted the bid to be a friendly offer, and Roberts wanted confirmation that they would be accepted warmly by Disney. He stepped into a phone booth and dialed Eisner's office. He came out of the booth a few minutes later, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "Michael said he wasn't interested. He didn't even hear a price. I couldn't get the words out. He's not interested at any price." The team was stunned. Clearly, their anxieties over negotiating with Mitchell were well-founded. Disney was not interested in selling. The issue was, the ball was already in motion. Comcast had labored over putting together a deal that they felt made sense for both parties. They had made their decision. The deal would just not be as pretty as they had hoped. This was no longer a friendly offer. It was an attempt to take over the Walt Disney Company. So once again, Disney found itself in virtually the same situation as in 1984, with profits dropping and takeover on the horizon. Diane Disney looked at her father's company from the outside, and decided to address the clear issues with the board. She felt that Roy and Gold had put the company in play by campaigning for Eisner's removal so publicly. But at the same time, she knew they were right. It was time for Eisner to go, and she wanted to make her opinion known. In her letter, she first made clear her feelings that Comcast was ill-suited to take over the Walt Disney Company, and that there was no need to sell the company at all. But at the end of her letter, she addressed the clear weakness she saw within Disney, Eisner himself. One of the greatest perceived weaknesses of the company has been Michael Eisner's unwillingness to identify and nurture anyone who might be deemed a successor to him. We believe all Disney shareholders would, like us, be relieved to know that someone very uniquely qualified to head the company was being groomed to replace Mr. Eisner when his contract terminates in 2006. We believe that the Walt Disney Company is the most magnificent entertainment company that the world has ever known, and that it will never be equaled. It is a company full of talented, creative people who value being part of the business that my father and uncle built. It is a company that deserves to stand alone, to remain independent as it has always been. Diane sent the letter to Eisner and prepared to send it to the remaining board members. She did not have their addresses, but managed to get them from Roy's office. Then suddenly, she received a call from Eisner. "Good letter, Diane," he said. "If you could just change that last paragraph." "But Michael," she said, "you've been there 20 years. Even university presidents don't stay that long." Eisner pressed further. "Can't you just say you support management?" But Diane would not back down. "I can't say that. I think it's time for you to go. You've done some wonderful things, but it's time." She continued to outline the missteps she saw in recent years, including the massive payout Disney made to Ovitz upon his departure. Eisner tried to argue the finer details, but Diane held firm. "I just think it's time for you to move out of the way for someone else." She mentioned that she felt Roy had gone about pushing the issue in the wrong way, but that everybody saw him as the company's hero. Eisner snapped. "It's the name! It's that Disney name!" He collected himself before asking once again, "Diane, please, just change that last paragraph. I'll write it for you." "Michael!" "I'll fax you a proposed rewrite of the letter." Despite Eisner's insistence to let him rewrite her letter, Diane sent it off to the board as initially written. But even when the daughter of Walt himself voiced concern over Eisner, nobody on the board responded. Meanwhile, Roy and Gold took their public campaign online, creating SaveDisney.com, a place where they could voice their points of opposition to Eisner and rally their troops. They knew that if they could get enough shareholders to withhold support for Eisner and his loyalists, it would perhaps be enough to force them out of the company. Campaigns like this had proven successful in other companies, such as when 22% of voters at AOL Time Warner withheld supporting votes for Chairman Steve Case, leading to his departure from the company. If they could get enough people to vote against Eisner, around 10 to 20%, then Roy and Gold felt the board would finally have to take action. Roy and Gold released a public letter on their website, addressed to all shareholders. "Now is the time for all Disney shareholders to take the first step in bringing needed change. Join us in voting no on the re-election of Michael Eisner, George Mitchell, Judith Estrin, and John Bryson as directors. By just saying no, you will send a message the board of directors cannot ignore. You will force the board to recognize the widespread conviction that serious changes in both senior management and the board are necessary." But just calling out shareholders was not enough. Roy and Gold also met with multiple proxy advisory companies, whose jobs are to advise company shareholders on how they should vote. After briefing the Institutional Shareholder Services, it only took the ISS 9 days to recommend shareholders vote against Eisner, which was a massive win for Roy. Soon after, another firm, Glass Lewis & Co., met with Roy and Gold, then with the Disney board. Their response and recommendation to their clients was not good for Disney. Quote, "The Disney board has been notoriously insular, famously gullible, and blindly loyal to Mr. Eisner. Given the control Mr. Eisner is accustomed to, we are troubled that he still wields tremendous power over the operation of this board. Our concerns are substantial." Things were looking worse and worse as time went on, and they looked even worse when Diane Disney made a rare statement to the press about Eisner's leadership. The Los Angeles Times quoted Diane as saying, "New leadership is necessary. I think Michael Eisner did some great things for the company, but there are also some not so great things." It was clear that since the board refused to respond to her directly, she had taken her concerns public, another critical blow for Eisner and his team. State pension funds in California, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Jersey all voiced support for Roy, along with a number of other large shareholders like Fidelity and T. Rowe Price. Eisner tried to rally any support he could from inside and outside of the company, but he could only find a few willing to stand up for him. Marty Sklar, head of Disney Imagineering, wrote that Eisner was a great creative force and the ideal creative partner. Jack Welch of General Electric called Eisner a creative genius. But it was more notable what was not being said. Barry Diller, who had worked alongside Eisner for a long time at Paramount, only said that he was a longtime friend and supporter. The Bass family failed to make any sort of statement at all. Few were willing to vouch for Eisner's leadership, or claim that he deserved to keep his job at the head of the table. While executives inside of the company were all loyal to Eisner, he was quickly recognizing that he had few friends left outside of his team. He had alienated so many of them over the years: Jeffrey Katzenberg, Michael Ovitz, Joe Roth, Rich Frank, Sandy Litvak, Stephen Bolenbach, not to mention those still in the company who could not stand working with him. Who was left to vouch for him? Who could he turn to for support? Eisner confided to his wife, "Everyone hates me." With the annual shareholders meeting fast approaching, Eisner and his team knew they needed to do something to try to win shareholders back to their side. One of the major complaints was that Eisner was both chairman of the board and CEO. Eisner, clutching his power within the company as tightly as possible, was unhappy with losing either position, but the pressure was mounting too high to be ignored any longer. So instead, Eisner proposed making George Mitchell the new chairman of the board. After all, Mitchell seemed to be completely loyal to Eisner, so in a sense, Eisner would only be losing power on paper. Plus, removing one of Eisner's titles would be a breach of his contract, allowing Eisner to leave with 30 days' notice with all of his benefits owed. He hoped that perhaps this would be enough to quell the anger of the shareholders. The next morning, thousands of shareholders and members of the press flooded into the Philadelphia Convention Center for the annual shareholders meeting. Outside of the building, protesters lined the sidewalks condemning Eisner's leadership in the Comcast takeover bid. As everybody took their seats, Eisner walked to the podium. Whispers and murmurs filled the auditorium as Eisner began to make his speech. He claimed that the company anticipated a substantial growth in performance in the coming year, and noted a 60% increase in stock price over the last year. He noted the issues with ABC, and claimed to be saddened over the loss of the Pixar relationship. But overall, Eisner was trying to show that the company was doing very well. "I love this company," he said in conclusion. "The board loves this company, and we are all passionate about the output from this company." Eisner sat in a seat on stage. Next, Tom Murphy and Ray Watson were allowed to make brief speeches. Both men had been pushed out due to the age mandate, same as Roy, and perhaps this was an effort to show that the two were okay with this change, whereas Roy was unfairly against it. But the tone changed dramatically when Gold came to the stage. The stale reception the previous speakers received was nothing compared to the cheers and applause Gold heard. "Roy Disney and I have been on a mission," he stated. "A mission not to promote ourselves, but to save our company." Gold went down the list of every failure made by Eisner's management team, then summed up his feelings, saying, quote, "Let me be clear, no half measures, no excuses, no amount of spinning will be tolerated. Michael Eisner must leave now." Gold turned to face Eisner. "You have compromised your soul and lost your integrity." Gold left the podium to make way for Roy, who received a thunderous barrage of applause. "The Walt Disney Company is more than just a business. It's an authentic American icon," he declared. "Our mission has always been to be bringers of joy, to be framers of the good in each of us, to be teachers, to speak as Walt once put it, not to children, but to the child in each of us. This is the core of what we have claimed to call Disney. Creativity is a funny thing," he continued. "It's a living, breathing force with a life of its own, and it tends to flower among individuals and in small groups." Roy stated that for Disney to regain its success, they must trust, quote, "the talents and imaginations of its creative people, by supporting them with the resources they require. We need to install a new management team. Speaking as someone with the name of Disney, it is my firm belief that we are not a commodity. As long as we continue to believe in the power of creative ideas, then our best years will still lie ahead." The audience again jumped to their feet and cheered. Eisner and his team took the next 2 hours to try to dismantle these claims and show how successful Eisner's management had been and continued to be. But it was clear that the audience of shareholders had already made their decision. Eisner stepped up to the podium and quickly adjourned the meeting, only for the crowd to shout in protest, "Vote! Vote! 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 I almost got away with that," he said. A joke, but perhaps also wishful thinking. The moment of truth had arrived. In total, 43% chose to withhold their vote from Eisner, along with 24% withholding for Mitchell. Of those votes, 72.5% of cast members at the parks had voted no for Eisner as well. Following Euro Disneyland's failure, mass budget cuts and declining quality in the parks had led to a staggering number of park employees voting against Eisner, something that Eisner's team had not expected. This was the largest vote in history against a CEO in a major American corporation. The vote, of course, did not mean that Eisner was ousted immediately. After the meeting, he turned to Mitchell and again asked him to take the position of chairman. But after seeing the staggering vote against him, Mitchell refused. His reputation had already taken enough of a blow. Eisner insisted, however, and managed to talk him into it, leading to Mitchell being named the new chairman of the board. The press was quick to point out that following the shareholder vote, Eisner had immediately lost one of his titles. Eisner tried to defend himself in the press, but at this point, nobody was listening to him. Roy and Gold pledged to mount a proxy fight to officially overthrow Eisner, an expensive plan that would be difficult for them to execute. But everybody seemed to feel that that would not be necessary. Eisner knew that his time at Disney was coming to a close. His grip on the Magic Kingdom was so tight that the structure was crumbling around him. An animation department that despised his leadership, a group of shareholders losing faith in him more by the minute, and a corporate takeover looming on the horizon. In June 2004, the board met to once again press Eisner on naming a successor. The board, despite having been fiercely loyal to Eisner, knew that he would be gone soon. Eisner's contract expired in 2006, and if he was not gone before then, the board would not be renewing his contract. Eisner, tired of fighting, finally named Bob Iger as his successor. By September, Eisner had decided to take his fate into his own hands. He penned a letter, with the help of his wife Jane, stating that he planned to retire as CEO of Disney at the end of his contract on September 30th, 2006. "Until then," he said, "I shall continue to exert every effort to help the company achieve our goals, to assist the board in selecting the new chief executive officer, and to make the transition expeditious, efficient, and smooth and easy." Gold and Roy worried that Eisner's plan was to cede the CEO role to Iger, while Eisner took back the chairman position, basically changing nothing. Their worries turned out to be unnecessary. In the end, after 20 years of leadership, Eisner made a clean exit from the Walt Disney Company. That is not to say that Eisner wanted it that way. Upon facing exile from the Magic Kingdom he had helped rebuild, Eisner worried most about his legacy at the company. When asked if he would take the position of chairman back, Eisner said, quote, "I don't want to be irrelevant. I'm not going to ask the board to be named chairman. I'm not going to beg for it. But the board might come to me. Then I'd have to consider it. Will I continue to play a creative role?" He paused. "That's up to Disney. I intend to create content forever, or at least for as long as I can." Six months after Eisner announced his plan to leave the company, the board unanimously named Bob Iger as the next CEO of the Walt Disney Company. It was also announced that Eisner would be leaving his role a year early, and 6 months later, he was gone. When Iger was crowned king of the Magic Kingdom, he quickly took steps to grow the company. In 2006, after noticing that children responded to Pixar characters more than any other Disney characters, he led the charge to purchase Pixar. In 2009, he negotiated to purchase Marvel Entertainment, allowing Disney to take the reins with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, earning the company billions of dollars in revenue. In 2012, Iger purchased Lucasfilm, again allowing the company to make billions of dollars from the Star Wars franchise and acquire the popular Indiana Jones franchise. And finally, in 2018, Disney began the process of purchasing 21st Century Fox, allowing Disney to release R-rated movies under the Fox label, similar to Touchstone Pictures. All in all, Iger has led the company to expand its assets in ways that solidified its future for years to come. Currently, the concept of a corporate takeover seems highly unlikely, as Disney remains a top player in the entertainment industry. At the same time, Iger lacks some of the qualities of his predecessor, Michael Eisner. In 2005, just prior to his departure from the company, Eisner lamented on the state of the industry. "This business is changing. I'm not sure you're going to see another chief executive in Hollywood like me. I think I'm probably the last of the creative types to run a company like this." Many times in the past, Eisner had questioned Iger's leadership capabilities as a creative executive. Iger's track record in terms of business is solid, but it is tough to gauge his abilities as a creative. Eisner, on the other hand, was always involved in the creative process. Even during his time at Paramount, Eisner had always valued strong creative concepts over blockbusters. High concepts paired with low budgets were his key to success. Eisner's management style was divisive and often nerve-wracking, but it is hard to deny the success during his early years at the company. When Michael Eisner and Frank Wells were brought in to replace the previous management team, Disney was in serious danger of being torn to shreds and left in the past. The two executives managed to dust off the company and push it in a new and exciting direction. Many of the most famous Disney movies, theme park rides, and iconic characters come from the Eisner era, and the company owes a great deal to the leadership of him and those around him. At the same time, the failure of Eisner and his team at the end of his tenure tarnished one of the greatest corporate success stories in American history. Often the death of Frank Wells is cited as the singular turning point in Eisner's run at the company, when things went from good to bad. In truth, the downward trend had already begun just before Wells' death, with the construction of Euro Disneyland, and the beginning of the end with Katzenberg's run at Disney. And while Eisner is not fully to blame for the Katzenberg debacle, his pettiness and vindictiveness certainly led to the dissolution of many corporate partnerships he held over the years. It was not just Katzenberg, Ovitz, Gold, and Roy who had issues with Eisner. Even those most loyal to Eisner, such as Wells and Iger, had incredibly troubled relationships with the CEO. Perhaps the death of Frank, as well as Eisner's own health issues, were contributing factors in the decline of Eisner's run at Disney. Or perhaps things were always going to go from good to bad the longer Eisner was at the head of the table. The truth is unclear. What is clear is that Eisner deserves a massive amount of credit for what he contributed to the company. Eisner and his team undoubtedly saved Disney, and for that, he deserves a massive amount of credit. But there is one man who perhaps deserves just as much credit as Eisner: Roy E. Disney, who had long been underestimated, overlooked, and ignored, had served as the greatest protector and champion of his family's legacy, saving the company from doom 2 times over. Roy had a tremendous amount of reverence for the work of his father, as well as his uncle Walt. Despite never getting the opportunity to run the company himself, Roy seemingly never cared about being the king of the Magic Kingdom. Roy was content sitting in the background, overseeing the creative endeavors of the company, and only speaking out when he saw the Disney legacy in danger of being tarnished. On top of that, Roy was a successful creative of his own, having directed many films himself, and oversaw the creation of many major Disney motion pictures. Although Fantasia 2000 was not a commercial success, Roy had personally overseen its development, wanting to carry forward the legacy of the original film that his uncle had been so proud of. And when Roy discovered a forgotten Walt Disney project, a short animation he had worked with Salvador Dali on called Destino, Roy helped push for the short film to be published, which was critically acclaimed and nominated for an Academy Award. Roy was willing to do whatever it took in service of the company, overthrowing his own cousin to bring in someone who could rejuvenate the creative energy within the company, then overthrowing that same person when he had overstayed his welcome. Although Roy was often content to stay behind the scenes in the company, he deserves a great deal of recognition for his work, and for his dedication to protecting the magic of the company, and when it was needed, to saving Disney.